Chapter 97. Dudian came to the front of the target. "Here, shoot a few arrows." The youth took out a black bow and quiver from the shelf next to him and encouraged him. Dean reached out and took it. He felt that the weight was slightly lighter than the hunter's bow, but for most scavengers, it was still extremely heavy. He immediately took out a common arrow and put it on his back. He pulled the string and aimed at the target in the distance. The target was about 30 meters away. With a swoosh, the arrow flew forward and nailed itself deeply into the target. However, it did not hit the bullseye. It was off by 1.5 rings. Not bad. Had he practiced before? The youth looked at it and was slightly surprised. Dudian nodded. "I have practiced for a few days. Just a few days." The young man nodded slightly and handed over a black bandage. He said, "Cover your eyes and shoot another arrow." Dudian nodded. He blindfolded and pulled the bow again. His mind searched for the approximate position of the previous target, although he could smell the faint smell of the target, but he didn't rely on it. He wanted to see whether he had the talent of an archer or not. Whoosh! The arrow was shot out. With a thud, the arrow was nailed into the target. Dudian pulled down the black band and looked at the target. The position was similar to the previous one. "It seems that you have the talent of an archer." There was a smile on the youth's face as he said, "Although your physique is high, but it's extremely rare to have such a result after a few days of training. If you work hard, then you may have the opportunity to become the second intermediate hunter in the consortium." Dudian was surprised. Is there only one hunter in the consortium who has reached the intermediate level? Well, there are a total of 8 intermediate hunters in the consortium. 2 knights, 3 warriors, 2 thieves, and 1 hunter. The youth smiled. There are few hunters. The main reason is that their individual combat ability is too poor. If there is no one to help them, it is difficult to hunt the prey. They rely too much on the team. Moreover, the hunter's skills are relatively difficult. This is the reason why intermediate hunters are rare. Hunter's individual combat ability is poor. Dudian couldn't help but look at him. He chose the hunter profession because of its individual combat ability. In his opinion, it was the strongest individual profession. However, he did agree with the fact that hunter skills were harder to learn. After all, warriors and knights were always fighting monsters on the front lines, so their combat skills would improve very quickly. On the other hand, hunters were only responsible for shooting arrows repeatedly from the back, so they could only gain very little insight and could only rely on practice makes perfect. Let's try the talents of other professions. The youth took Dean to the second drawing area. There were several wooden dolls. There were all kinds of swords, whips, hammers, and other weapons of different lengths on the shelves. However, there was no spear. The spear was the exclusive symbol of the knight. Attack the wooden puppet and smash it to pieces. Use whatever weapon is convenient for you, the young man said with a smile. Dudian nodded. He picked up the sword and came in front of a wooden figure. He used all the ways he could think of to hack it. The repeated slashes made him feel awkward and uncomfortable. The blade would slip if he used too much force. Dudian knew that a sword was not suitable for him, so he switched to a dagger. Compared to a sword, a dagger was much more convenient. It was longer than a dagger and could be used like a dagger. He liked it very much. He didn't feel tired even if he continued to hack. Next were other weapons, whips, hammers, knives. Dudian tried them one by one. In the end, he felt that he was more comfortable with a dagger and a knife. The youth also gave such an evaluation based on his results. Your warrior talent is also good, but a hunter is better. Let's look at your knight talent. The youth said. The knights here were different from the knights inside the giant wall. Although the fighting style was similar, the knights inside the giant wall paid more attention to moral character. They would go through a strict assessment before being awarded a knight medal. But they were purely fighting outside the giant wall. Everything was based on strength. Dudian was sitting on a rocking wooden horse, holding a spear and constantly waving it. He felt extremely uncomfortable. The youth looked at him and shook his head. He let Dudian carry out the last test. The core of a thief was hiding and evading. The way of the test was a large cage full of swords and guns. The cage would constantly shake, and the swords and guns inside would constantly shake. There was no rule. It was completely decided by the reaction speed of the individual nerves. Change into this. The youth handed Dudian a set of heavy black iron armor. Dudian immediately put it on and felt his actions were clumsy. After entering the iron cage, the young man pressed the mechanism, and the iron cage immediately shook. The swords and sabers inside were like countless soldiers surrounding and suppressing him, stabbing at him in a disorderly manner. Dudian hurriedly dodged left and right. His eyes quickly swept left and right. Occasionally, he caught a glimpse of silver light from the corner of his eyes. He quickly bowed his head to dodge. His body's instinctive reaction was extremely sensitive. As he dodged for a long time, he soon grasped a certain pattern from the shaking of his feet. Nevertheless, there were still 2 or 3 spears that stabbed his body. But he was protected by the black iron armor, so he wasn't injured. Soon, the test was over. The youth opened the cage. His face was full of amazement. "Gee, I didn't expect you to be so agile. Although your physique is relatively high, but to have such a reaction speed is too strong. You can become a thief. Your talent in this aspect will definitely allow you to reach the level of intermediate hunter as soon as possible. After so many years in the consortium, your talent as a thief is definitely in the top 3. No, the top 2. Dudian didn't expect to get such an evaluation. His heart was happy, but after thinking about it, he still said, "I still like to be a hunter. I can kill the enemy from thousands of meters away." Okay. The youth sighed regretfully. He didn't insist. After all, this was just a simple test. It could roughly see some talent. It was not completely accurate. Many people were not good at the beginning, but later they became more skilled than those who were good at the beginning. He had seen several such examples. Moreover, interest was a very key in boring skill practice. This was why the consortium didn't force a profession, but let the hunters choose their own. Although your talent as a hunter and thief is very high, but don't be arrogant and complacent. You have to train well. The consortium doesn't give you much time. Strive to become a real hunter within a year. The youth earnestly said, "Although your learning time is only 1/3 of the other trainee hunters, but you have mastered the magic marks. Your physique has been enhanced in all aspects, so it will be easier to learn. After a year, if you don't pass the skills assessment, the consortium will force you to go outside the giant wall so that you can hone your skills in actual combat. However, you should also understand the dangers outside the giant wall. So work hard. If you are lazy today, you will lose your life tomorrow." Dudian nodded. "I know." Chapter 98. The hunter training ground was located on the other side of the river behind the castle. There was a very wide grassland. At the moment, there were 5 figures standing on one side of the grassland. They were pulling bows and shooting arrows. The targets were 100 meters away from each other. The 5 of them consisted of 4 men and 1 woman. Each of them was served by 2 people dressed like servants, either passing them arrows or serving them tea. At this time, the youth came to the field and clapped his hands. The 5 people suddenly stopped and looked over. "I'm going to introduce you to a new companion or future senior." The youth smiled and pointed to Dean. "His name is Dean. He will train with you from today." The 5 people suddenly looked at Dean. Their first impression was that he was handsome, and the second was that he was quiet. "Instructor, he is a newcomer. How can he be our senior?" One of the pale-skinned teenagers frowned. The youth smiled and said, "Dean used to be a scavenger. He accidentally got magic marks. He is already a veritable hunter. What he lacks is professional skills. He will study here for a year and will graduate. In the future, he will naturally be your senior unless you can complete your training before he graduates." The 5 people were surprised, including the pale-skinned teenager. They could not help but look at Dean a few times. The youth took Dean to an empty shelf and said, "This is your position. In view of your hunter's physique, today's training is to shoot a bronze bow 1,000 times. You will finish when you finish. Don't think about dragging it until tomorrow. Otherwise, you will never have dinner." Dudian nodded, indicating that he understood. He had seen the cruelty outside the giant wall. The purpose of his training was not simply to complete the task, but to improve himself. No matter how many tasks the young instructor set, he would exhaust himself to the extreme. The distance of each arrow must exceed the line below the target position. In the first 7 days, you will not be required to hit the target with 100 arrows. But the number of arrows must not be less than 1,000. The young instructor changed his previous easygoing attitude and said in a cold and serious tone. Dean nodded. Apparently, the young instructor had already made arrangements. There were 2 servants standing in front of the vacant shelf. The young instructor waved his hand. One of the servants struggled to hand over the bow and arrows to Dean. Dean took the bow. It was heavy. It was similar to the previous talent test. But for him, it was nothing. He immediately aimed at the target position and began to shoot. The young instructor looked at Dudian for a while and felt bored. He said to Dudian, "If you need anything, just tell them. They're the servants responsible for your training." Dean nodded slightly and continued to draw the bow and arrows. The initial training for a hunter was to repeatedly shoot arrows to improve the accuracy of their arrows. After all, this was a hunter's main method of attack. When they were hunting with their companions, it was very common for a hunter to make a mistake, resulting in the death of their companions under the claws of monsters. Therefore, the hunter's requirement for accuracy was almost insane. There was a 13 or 14-year-old boy next to Dudian. He curiously looked at Dudian while shooting arrows. He wanted to see how powerful a real hunter with magic marks was. Soon, the teenager was disappointed. Dean's archery level was worse than his. More than 10 arrows had not hit the target at a distance of 100 meters. All of them missed the target, but the distance was quite far. It seems that a hunter is nothing more than a strong physique. There is nothing special. The teenager thought in his heart. He no longer paid attention to Dean and continued his archery training. Dean repeatedly shot an arrow. After shooting dozens of arrows, he gradually felt that he had mastered some of the feeling of shooting, such as the angle of aiming, the approximate deviation from the actual position, and the change of angle caused by the strength of the shooting force. In the old era, it was extremely difficult to shoot a target of 100 meters. But the physique of Dean and the 5 apprentice hunters was not that of ordinary people in the old era. Needless to say, these 5 apprentice hunters could pull such a heavy bow. Naturally, they had received God's blessing. It must be known that the heavier the bow, the greater the strength. The advantage of the strength, in addition to being able to shoot farther, would also be higher accuracy. The fundamental principle of the closer the shot was, the easier was to hit the target. Ordinary people's hunting bow will weaken after shooting for 50 meters. The arrow will slide down due to the influence of the airflow. But for my heavy bow, 80 meters is like 10 meters. The arrow is still flying at full strength. In other words, the stronger the tension of the bow, the farther the shot will be. It seems that I have to get a good bow in the future. Dean explored the feeling of shooting and also thought about his future plans. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He kept shooting arrows. His movements were single and repeated. When the arrows in the basket were used up, the servant next to him would help him reload. After shooting 200 arrows, Dean's hit rate had significantly improved. Basically, 2 out of 10 arrows would hit the target. After all, his physique was high. Once he became proficient, the hit rate would rapidly increase. However, hitting the target was just the beginning. If he wanted to go further, the difficulty would increase tenfold. When the teenager next to him was resting, he inadvertently caught a glimpse of Dean's target. He was stunned for a moment. There were more than 30 arrows stuck on the target. In this short time, he only shot 160 arrows. Even if Dean was faster than him, the gap was not big. In this way, the hit rate was not low. Although it could not be compared with him, at least it was hopeful to meet the young instructor's training requirements. "Change the target," Dean said. A servant immediately put on a black armor and carefully ran over to change the new target. After changing the target, Dean continued to pull the bow and shoot. With a sound, the arrow hit the target. Dean shot another arrow, and with a sound, it hit the target again. Dean continued to shoot. Soon, 5 out of 10 arrows hit the target. Although 3 arrows were at the outermost edge of the target and almost missed the target, but the result was already considered good. Dean thought of the undead outside the giant wall. He narrowed his eyes and regarded the target as a standing undead. He used the red heart as its head and pulled the bow and arrow to shoot continuously. After shooting 400 arrows in a row, Dean felt that his arm was extremely sore. He had to stop and rest. After his arm recovered a little, he continued to shoot. Soon, it was dusk and the sun was setting. Dean had shot 800 arrows. After shooting 500 arrows, his hit rate had declined. His arms were sore and swollen, making it impossible for him to maintain stability. The rest of the archery was purely an exercise for his arms and the feeling of shooting. At this time, the next 5 trainee hunters had completed their respective tasks. They were tired and panting. After saying goodbye to Dean, they left. Dean stood in front of the sunset. His face was dripping with hot sweat. He gritted his teeth and kept shooting. Every time his arm was sore, there would be a voice in his heart that kept persuading him to stop and rest. At this moment, he would deliberately think of the undeads outside the wall, the ferocious appearance, and the feeling of helplessness when being chased. Then the blood in his heart would surge, and he would continue to shoot. Inertia was inborn, but persistence was his own choice. Chapter 99. The sky was getting dark. Dean was still pulling the bow and shooting arrows. Every time he pulled the bow, it was extremely strenuous and even painful, but he still shot the arrows one by one. 2 servants stood next to him and looked at each other. They had replaced 57 quiver of arrows for Dean. Each quiver had 20 arrows, so it had already exceeded the number of 1,000 arrows. Elder, your 1,000 arrows task has been completed. One of the servants hesitated for a moment, but still interrupted Dean's training and said. Dean gasped and said, I know, continue to change the arrows. After that, he continued to pull the bow. When he was too tired to pull the bow, he took a short break to recover and then continued to shoot arrows. Until around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, Dean was completely tired and could no longer pull the bow. He had to stop and ask the young servant next to him, How many arrows? 1,290 arrows. The servant quickly replied. Dean gasped and thought, 10 more arrows to reach the round number. His obsessive-compulsive disorder was playing tricks in his heart. He planned to go back to rest, but now he was serious. Soon, after intermittent rest and shooting arrows, Dean spent a quarter of an hour to make up 10 arrows. He was satisfied and ready to leave. At this time, the young instructor came from the distance and saw Dean next to the shelf. He was surprised. Not finished yet? It's done. Duddian gasped. The young instructor looked at the 2 servants next to him and saw them nodding slightly. He knew that Dean was not fooling him. He smiled. Go back and rest. These 1,000 arrows are based on your physique. When others first came here, they were tired with 300 arrows a day. Now, they can only achieve 800 arrows a day. After all, your physical strength is much higher than theirs. 1,000 arrows is your starting point. We will continue to gradually increase your training volume. Don't neglect or be lazy, understand? Dean nodded. Go back and have a good rest. The young instructor waved. Dean handed the bow to the servant and turned away from the lawn. He was so tired that his arms were still slightly trembling. The place to sleep at night was a nearby castle for trainee hunters. All the trainee hunters were privately trained by the consortium. Duddian came to the front hall to have dinner. He had to say that the life of the hunter special training was completely different from that of the scavengers. The scavengers were thoroughly trained. They lived in poor conditions and ate poor food. They were trained to adapt to the living conditions outside the giant wall. But hunters were different. As long as they completed their tasks every day, they would be able to enjoy other aspects of material enjoyment. There was a specially hired chef waiting for them at any time, and they could order whatever they wanted. As long as they completed the task before 9 p.m., they could eat as much as they wanted. Dean arrived at 8:45. He ordered a pan-fried blood steak and a foie gras. Both of these were poultry raised in the giant wall. The effect of nuclear radiation was relatively shallow, so the degree of mutation wasn't obvious. After generations of reproduction, the definition had changed from mutation to evolution. It belonged to non-polluting poultry and was the favorite food of the aristocracy. After eating, Dean went back to the room arranged by the young instructor to sleep. The room was independent and very spacious. It was a rare enjoyment for Dean, who was used to living a hard life. The night passed quickly. The next day, he got up on time and came to the hall under the castle. He saw a lot of people who were almost the same age as him. One of them was the trainee hunter that he had trained with yesterday. "Good morning." The teenager saw Dudian and calmly greeted him. "My name is Tersun. I heard that you came back very late last night. The first day must have been very hard for you. I can't believe that I gave you 1,000 arrows training. You are worthy to be the one who got the magic marks. You can even complete such a terrible requirement." Dean politely said, "You will get the magic mark in the future." The teenager smiled and didn't say anything. He said goodbye to Dean and went to the side to get his breakfast. Dean also went to the queue and asked for his own breakfast. After eating, he moved his arms. After a night of recovery, there was still some sore feeling. He knew that today's practice would be more difficult. After eating breakfast, Dean came to the lawn. At the moment, the other 5 people hadn't arrived yet. The servants also hadn't arrived yet. Dean didn't pay attention to them and began a practice. After shooting 100 arrows, he saw the other 5 people coming. The young instructor's training was very free. As long as the task was completed on the day, no matter how long the training was, he could arrange his own time. After the 5 people arrived, they greeted each other and began to train. A single training course in day-after-day life was extremely boring for a child of Dean's age. But Dean was very patient since childhood. He had seen the destruction of the world and the cruelty outside the giant wall. This made his thirst for power stronger. This desire surpassed all other interests of fun. In the blink of an eye, another day passed. The young instructor came to see them several times. He guided them on the basic posture of archery and the roll of the shoulders, arms, and other parts of the body. Then he left. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Dean was so tired that his arms cramped and had to stop. Today's task was barely up to 1,200 arrows, 100 less than yesterday's. The main reason was that yesterday's overdraft was too big, and the after effects of arm soreness had affected today. Dean dragged his body back to the castle. After dinner, he went back to the room and fell asleep. The next 3rd and 4th day, Dean went back at 8 o'clock in the evening as usual. On the 3rd day, the number of arrows shot skyrocketed to 1,500 arrows. The sore feeling in his arms had gradually adapted after the night's rest. On the 4th day, the number of arrows shot had reached 1,600 arrows. In the high-intensity training, Dean's body was also adjusting and adapting quickly. The 5 people who trained with Dean all felt the progress of Dean's archery. The hit rate was almost twice as high as before. Almost every 10 arrows, only 1 or 2 arrows would miss the target, and the rest would all hit the target. Of course, this was the probability of the first few hundred arrows. The more the arrows, the lower the hit rate. It was negligible. Even so, the 5 people were surprised by such progress in just a few days. However, thinking that Dean was a hunter who had master magic marks, his physique was several times higher than theirs. Such amazing progress could be explained. Nevertheless, the 5 people were still somewhat unconvinced. Even if they were facing a hunter who had mastered magic marks, they didn't want to be quickly overtaken by a newcomer. So in the next few days, they were more serious about their attitude when shooting. Instead of shooting casually like before, they just hoped that the arrows could fly over the target. In the blink of an eye, 7 days had passed. Dean had increased the number of arrows shot every day to 1,800. Now that you have adapted, from today on, the number of arrows you shoot every day will increase to 1,500 arrows. The young instructor said coldly and harshly. Moreover, the number of arrows that hit the target must reach 300. Dean nodded and didn't say anything. In fact, the number of arrows he had hit the target had reached about 500, almost double the task set by the young instructor. However, he didn't care about the task given by the young instructor. His goal was to surpass himself and squeeze himself to the limit. Chapter 100. The hard training continued. In the blink of an eye, another 7 days had passed. The young instructor seemed to use 7 days as a phase. On the 8th day of archery training, he once again set a new task target for Dean. The number of arrows per day had increased by 100. He needed to complete 1,600 arrows, and 400 of them must hit the target. This time, he didn't directly increase the number of arrows by 500. Perhaps he considered that there was a limit to his physique. According to the young instructor's assessment, it would be very difficult for Dean to complete 1,500 arrows with his physique. It would be extremely difficult for him to increase the number of arrows by 100. 2,000 arrows was basically the limit of Dean's physical strength. His assessment was based on a variety of information and was very accurate. However, he did not know that when he set this task target, Dean had increased the number of arrows to 2,080. Moreover, this record was immediately broken on the second day, reaching 2,112 arrows. The more time passed, the slower the number of arrows Dean could shoot. His physical strength had already reached the limit or even broke through the limit. Moreover, his hit rate had reached 700 arrows. In other words, he could continuously and steadily shoot 700 arrows. This was absolutely a terrible level, and it meant that he had really entered the door of archery. However, it was just the door. After all, the target was static and the target area was relatively large. If he wanted to accurately hit a smaller bullseye range, the difficulty would be even greater. In the blink of an eye, another half a month passed. On the hunter training ground, whoosh, 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 the arrows flew out continuously, and the arrows hit the target. Out of 3 arrows, 1 arrow hit the bullseye. Dean's movements were stable. Yesterday's tired and sore arms had almost recovered after a night's rest. His body had fully adapted to such high-intensity training. When he shot 200 arrows, the other 5 people came to the training ground one after another. In this month of archery training, Dean's rapid progress had made the 5 people sit up and take notice of him. However, thinking that Dean was a hunter with magic marks, the 5 people's hearts were both envious and somewhat jealous. Not long after the 5 people arrived, the young instructor also came. In addition to the release of task indicators, his expression was very easygoing. He chuckled to Dean. Today is the first month of training. The number of arrows you shoot every day has reached 2,000. Even if you have reached the limit, you have completed the target I gave you on time. I believe that your arm strength is now very stable. Dean stopped and looked at him. Next, it's time to teach you the first archery skill of a beginner hunter. Once you've mastered it, you'll be considered a qualified archer. The young instructor smiled and picked up another black bow and quiver from the shelf. He pulled out a dark arrow and put on the bow. Look carefully. This is called rapid arrow. As soon as he finished speaking, he loosened his fingers and the tendon string shot out. With a swoosh, the arrow shot through the air and nailed itself on the target, hitting the bullseye. As Dean looked back at the young instructor, he heard a sound coming from the target. He couldn't help but look at the target and saw 2 arrows nailed in the bullseye. You didn't see it clearly. The young instructor smiled and said, "The so-called rapid-fire arrow refers to the rapid shooting of the arrows without pause. The difficulty of this move lies in its stability and speed. The 2 arrows must be shot in a line so that it can cause the greatest damage. If you encounter a monster with a strong defense, the first arrow will tear through its scales, the second arrow will pierce through its flesh and bones, and the third arrow will take its life." Dean looked at it and nodded. "I know. You have just learned it. I'll give you half a month to master 2 consecutive shots." The young instructor's face was cold and solemn. "If you haven't mastered it by then, you'll get a hellish training." Dean nodded slightly to show that he understood. Remember, the key to this move is stability. At the same time, the speed of drawing and loading the arrow must be fast, accurate, and stable. The young instructor instructed. As he spoke, he quickly loaded the arrow and shot 2 arrows consecutively, both hitting the bullseye. This time Dean saw it clearly. The speed of the arrow was so fast that it was like a shadow. Almost as soon as the first arrow was shot, the second arrow was already on the bullseye. His hand speed was amazing. Under the watchful eyes of the young instructor, Dean also began to practice. Soon, he felt the difficulty. The first was to draw the arrow. When he touched the quiver on his back, he might not be able to catch the arrow at the first time. Occasionally, he would catch the arrow, but because of the wrong gesture or the wrong position, the speed would slow down and he couldn't shoot continuously. The young instructor watched him practice for a while, told him, "Practice well." Then he turned and left. Dudyan practiced repeatedly. Another day passed. He was completely immersed in the process of quickly shooting and quickly shooting. When a servant reminded him at 8 o'clock in the evening, he came back to his senses and subconsciously asked, "How many arrows have you shot today?" 2,530 arrows. The servant said. Dean was a little surprised. Since 3 days ago, the number of arrows he shot had been stable at about 2,350 arrows. Today, he unexpectedly increased by 180 arrows in one breath. It must be known that his physical strength had long reached the limit. "I'm too into it, so I don't feel tired." Dean woke up and suddenly saw the blisters on his fingers. Water and blood flowed out. He immediately wrapped his clothes and went back to eat. The next day, Dean came early as usual and continued to practice rapid arrow. The more times he practiced, the more Dean understood rapid arrow. However, with the understanding, he gradually rejected this archery. Rapid arrow shooting, although 2 or even 3 arrows in a row, are very lethal, but the shortcomings are also very obvious. The rapid shooting will lead to the weakening of the power of each arrow. The real damage caused by 3 arrows is at most equal to 1.5 arrows. Dean thought in his heart, "If I can kill with 1 arrow, why do I need 3 arrows? It's better to practice the previous arrow." Although the speed is slow, but the hunter's fighting style is to ambush and shoot. As long as I can kill with 1 arrow, it's fine. Moreover, people's energy is limited. It takes too long to practice rapid arrow. It's better to concentrate on learning. He decided to go to the extreme. Anything that reached the pinnacle would be terrifying. Whether it was speed is unbreakable or strength to defeat 10. It was a kind of extreme. Although the rapid arrow looked good, fancy, and seemed powerful, Dean felt that it was not worth wasting energy to learn it. He wanted to practice the most destructive archery, and it was best to be able to kill with 1 arrow. Thinking of this, Dean gave up practicing rapid arrow and continued to repeat the previous basic archery. However, this time he did not blindly pursue quantity, but thought about how to make the destructive power greater. Chapter 101. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye. In the repeated archery training, Dean's accuracy had increased rapidly. Almost every arrow could hit the target before his arms lost control and trembled. 7 out of 10 arrows could hit the bullseye. For an ordinary person, it would take at least 3 to 5 years of hard training to achieve such results. But with Dean's hunter's physique, in just 2 months or so, he had completed such rapid progress. Of course, this was inseparable from his extreme training day and night. In addition to accuracy, almost all of Dean's arrows penetrated the target, and the lethality was significantly improved. However, his rapid arrows did not make the slightest progress. When the young instructor came to check his results, he was immediately angry. "You have learned to this level in half a month? The posture of pulling the arrow is so ugly. It's too negligent. Don't think that you are a hunter because you have magic marks. When you really go outside the giant wall to hunt, you can only hunt some low-level monsters that scavengers can kill." The young instructor angrily announced, "Since you can't even learn the rapid arrows and like to be lazy, from tomorrow onwards, you will practice basic archery for a month. Do you know your mistake?" Dean thought it would be a hellish punishment, but he didn't expect it to be basic archery. His heart couldn't help but smile, and his joy was slightly revealed from the corner of his mouth. Such an indifferent appearance made the young instructor even more furious. So, in the next month, the young instructor greatly increased the number of arrows that Dean had to shoot every day. It suddenly increased to 2,200 arrows. In his view, such overload training had completely exceeded Dean's physical fitness. If he did not reach the target on time, there would be no dinner. Without dinner, the next day's training would be slower. In this way, he would fall into a vicious cycle. Every day, he would face an overload of training. It would make a person overtired and even collapse. This could greatly temper the willpower. This was also the purpose of the young instructor's training. Although it was a punishment, but the consortium style was based on profit. It was not what the consortium wanted. So although it was a punishment, it was mainly to improve one of Dean's abilities. Dean's number of arrows had already reached the level of 2,800 arrows. The super high standard set by the young instructor had been easily exceeded. He continued to immerse himself in his own understanding of archery. Outside the giant wall, Melon Consortium Area No. Unlike the other areas under the jurisdiction of the Melon Consortium, there were almost no broken high-rise buildings and metal wreckage everywhere. This area was extremely empty, like a vast wilderness. There were no weeds. Occasionally, you could see broken and collapsed highways that were covered with thick moss and dust. This showed that this area was once an urban area. However, there was not a single complete building in sight. Broken stones and bloodstains were everywhere, and corpses were rarely seen. The bloodstains turned into pale red water under the washing of the calamity rain, flowing to every corner of the crevice. When they dried up, they became natural and beautiful patterns branded on the ground. At this moment, beside a pile of corpses, 5 figures appeared like ghosts. They quietly leaned against the wall and looked at the broken street beside the wall. There were 2 half-foot-deep dents in the ground, about a meter long. There was a pile of black filth next to the dent, giving off a pungent smell. If one looked closely, one could see some bone residue and corroded metal in the filth. One of the figures quietly stepped forward, picked up a stone, and poked the lump of dirt. He saw that it was soft and mushy. He immediately came back and whispered, "From the degree of dryness, it should be less than 2 hours since it left here." "Chase," one of them said. The 5 moved quickly and quietly along the huge dents in the ground to catch up. After a quarter of an hour, one of them suddenly gestured for them to stop. The man lowered his voice and said in a dignified tone, "I smell it. It's 3 o'clock in front of us. It should be about 8 kilometers away from us." "Very good. You prepare to ambush them from behind. The 4 of us will go," one of the leaders said excitedly. The first man nodded, but his face suddenly changed. He hurriedly said, "Not good. Quickly hide." Puff! From the ground under the feet of the few people, several sharp claws jumped out. One of them pierced through the back of the man who had just spoken. Hunter HQ, an old castle by the Nile River. A letter was sent by a black crow from the window and fell on the table. When he saw the red mark on the bottom left corner of the envelope, West, who was enjoying his afternoon tea with the help of a maid, narrowed his eyes. He could not be bothered to continue eating and drinking leisurely. He quickly pushed away the charming maid and sat in front of his desk. With a grave expression, he quickly opened the envelope. Traces of the Black Weaver appeared in Area Number 1 and killed 3 hunters. When West saw the contents of the report, his face couldn't help but change. He hurriedly looked at the situation. The 6th team was attacked by the Black Weaver while they were tracking the mountain lion. Only the captain and 1 team member escaped with serious injuries. Finally couldn't bear to come out. Damn beast. West held the letter tightly. The next moment, he quickly took out the letter and put it back in his envelope. He hung the letter on the feet of the black crow. He patted the black crow's feathers. "Go to Glen." The black crow shook its wings and flew out of the window. Hunter training ground. Dean was training as usual. He was constantly pulling and shooting arrows. His accuracy was getting sharper and sharper. He even wanted to find a moving target to practice. Suddenly, the young instructor came to the training ground in a hurry. He found Dean and handed him a letter. "This is an emergency sign. given to you by the consortium. There is a situation outside the giant wall. There is a temporary lack of free hunters. You have filled in the fear of Stain's ability. The consortium wants you to go outside the giant wall to perform an urgent task. Hurry up and prepare. Dean cannot help but stop. But I'm still in training. This is an emergency sign. As long as you're not performing other tasks outside the giant wall and can't be contacted, you have to put down all your work and respond to the consortium summons. The young instructor spoke quickly. Your hunter armor has been ordered. It will be sent to you soon. Stop and don't waste your stamina. Go and replenish your energy. Someone will come and pick you up and take you outside the giant wall. So urgent? Dean quickly put down the bow. He didn't want to waste his physical strength. Is there no other resting hunter? Chapter 102. What is the urgent task? Is it dangerous? Dean couldn't help but ask. The young instructor replied, I heard that there's a rare monster that has been given a name. It is a bit dangerous, but the team that will go with you is led by Glenn, one of the two strongest hunters of the consortium. You're only responsible for tracking the smell. They will protect you as long as you don't fall behind. Rare monster? Dean thought about the consortium's evaluation of the Defiler. Was a monster of the same level? He immediately asked, Can I go to the residential area first? Of course not. The young instructor didn't think. It is an emergency. Time is very tight. Come with me to the hall of the hunting castle. The others should have already arrived. He grabbed Dean's hand and ran away. Dean was anxious. He didn't have time to configure black gunpowder for self-defense. He was unavoidably worried because he was barehanded and his newly learned archery skills. Soon, under the young instructor's lead, the two of them crossed the river and came to the castle on the other side of this territory that was leaning against the mountain ridge. This castle was completely black, like a black evil beast crawling on the ground, full of a gloomy atmosphere. The young instructor took Dean to the front of the castle and said, Go in. They are waiting for you inside. I will prepare some dry food for you. Dean thanked him in his heart. After the instructor left, he turned around and took a deep breath to enter the castle. The guards at the door didn't stop him and opened the giant door for him. The front hall of the castle was dimly lit. There were 6 figures, 4 men and 2 women. They were talking about something when they heard the sound of the door opening. Is this the little guy? One of them asked. Another youth said, I heard that he is a lucky scavenger rookie. Most likely it is him. At this time, a slim figure came out of the crowd. It was a beautiful woman in her early 20s. She was wearing a tight-fitting black hunter's armor. She glanced at Dean and said, Immediately put on your armor and get ready to go. Dean suddenly felt that the woman was somewhat familiar. He suddenly remembered that when he had just become a scavenger, he was invited to the aristocratic banquet. He had seen 2 hunters, and this woman was one of them. Presumably, she and the youth were the 2 strongest hunters of the consortium. No wonder the aristocrats would take the initiative to greet them. Their attitude was extremely friendly, including the people of Mel's main family. Yes, Dean glanced around and saw a pile of black armor on the chair next to him. He trotted over and opened it. The size was consistent with his height. It should be prepared for him. In addition to the armor, there was a black bow. Dean carried the bow and quiver on his back and said to the woman, I'm ready. Yes. The woman nodded slightly as she saw Dean was so efficient. She said to the others, This time the black weaver has appeared. We must try our best to catch it. We can't let it slip away again. Once we are outside the giant wall, all of you stay alert. Do you hear me? Yes. The other 5 stood at attention and shouted. Glenn nodded and waved her hand. Let's go. He pushed open the front door and came to the stable next to the castle. There were more than 10 black horses in the stable. They wore simple steel helmets to protect them from being bitten by the monsters in the radiation zone when they passed through the radiation zone. Although the monsters in the radiation zone couldn't be compared to the monsters outside the giant wall, but it was still extremely dangerous. However, this was not under the management of consortium hunters like Dean. It was handled by the army and the Knights of Light from the Holy Church. Everyone turned over and mounted the horse. Dean saw that the young instructor hadn't delivered the dry food yet, so he could only give up. He turned over and climbed on a big horse. Glenn shouted, "Go!" The team of 7 people, including Dean, immediately galloped along the path of the territory. After leaving the territory, everyone went straight to the wasteland of the radiation zone. Along the way, they occasionally bumped into some beasts in the radiation zone. There were pythons coiled on the roadside and small groups of 3 to 5 wolves. These monsters had slight changes in their bodies due to the infiltration of the radiation zone. Some parts of their bodies ulcerated, and some parts of their bodies grew strange cuticle. These hungry beasts saw Dean and others and were about to pounce on them. Glenn snorted and didn't do anything. The hungry beasts quickly retreated in fear. It seemed that they had encountered something extremely vicious. Dean wasn't surprised. He knew that it was because of her magic marks. Otherwise, it would be difficult to scare away the beasts, especially the hungry beasts. But the magic marks were different. They carried the smell of the monsters outside the giant wall. For these beasts, hunters were like monsters in human skin. It was good enough that they didn't hunt them. How would they dare to take the initiative to come and feed themselves? Soon, everyone arrived outside the giant wall. "You are here. The passage has been opened for you." A middle-aged man, wearing the uniform of the Melon Consortium, stood in front of the giant wall. Glenn nodded to him. She dismounted and took the lead to enter the passage. They came to the dark underground passage. Glenn and the other 5 stopped halfway. They clasped their hands together and prayed to the goddess of the hunt engraved on the wall of the passage. But because of the urgency of the situation, they only prayed symbolically and quickly walked along the passage. Dean glanced at them and followed behind them. Once again, they came to the outside of the giant wall. Dean found that the entrance to the passage was different from the last one. It should be another entrance controlled by the consortium. Outside the entrance was not a plain, but a forest of more than 20 meters high trees. Each tree was like a lonely pin without branches or leaves. Glenn entered the forest of giant trees. She was familiar with the path and quickly moved in a direction. The others followed and protected Dean in the center of the team. Dean suddenly felt the gap between him and the other hunters. They could easily keep up with Glenn's pace, but he needed to use 70 to 80% of his strength to keep up. Otherwise, he would fall behind. It seems that there are physical differences even between primary hunters. Dean thought, but I haven't used the god's blessing that I have accumulated in the last 2 months. There are also 210 cold crystals collected in area number 9. Along the edge of the forest of giant trees, there was a broken highway covered with moss. "Bridge," Glenn said and quickly jumped onto the highway. The corner of Dean's mouth twitched as he followed behind. "Area number 1 is in front of us." Glenn looked back at Dean and said, "When we reach area number 1, you just have to protect yourself. It is best not to take it lightly. Melon Consortium has more than 20 areas. It is the strongest area except for the forbidden area. All the monsters inside are above level 10. This time we're going to catch a level 26 mature black weaver." Chapter 103. Hunting Level 26. Dean looked at her in horror. Although he had been practicing archery, but he had learned about the monsters outside the giant wall in the spare time of eating. For example, the last time he had hunted the Defiler was a hunting level 9 monster, and the ordinary undeads he had seen were hunting level 4 monsters. As for the Bonebiter rats, they were hunting level 3 monsters. But this time he was going to face a terrifying monster with a hunting level of 26 foot. Dean couldn't imagine what kind of terrifying existence it was. The pores on his body couldn't help but shrink. His heart was filled with a chill. Almost his first reaction was to escape. However, when he saw Glenn's unquestionable eyes, he suddenly understood that there was no way back. Although there was some panic in his heart, but he still forced himself to calm down quickly. At this point, he could only think of a way to save his life. His brain was racing, although he hadn't met the monster yet, but he felt an unprecedented crisis. What kind of monster is it? Does it have any special ability? Dean asked while thinking. Named monsters like these all had some special genetic mutation abilities. You don't need to know this. Another youth indifferently said, You are responsible for tracking its smell. You don't need to do anything. Just protect yourself. Glenn took out a string of black fragments from the small bag on her back and handed it to Dean. This is the carapace of the black weaver. Write down the smell on it. If it's convenient, can you tell me the range of the smell you can trace? Dean took the palm-sized black shell. It looked like the shell on the back of a snail. It was smooth but extremely hard. There was a layer of sticky, yellowish, viscous material on the inside of the shell. It had dried up and exuded a strong, fishy smell. He looked at it and gave it back to Glenn. I can smell strong odors up to about 20 miles away. Some lighter odors can only be smelled up to about 10 miles away. Glenn and the other 5 couldn't help but look at Dean. There was a trace of surprise in their eyes. Such a range of smell could be ranked in the top 5 of the consortium's scent tracking ability. But Dean was just a newcomer. Once his physique was enhanced, his range of smell would expand exponentially. His ranking would be even higher. Yes, Glenn nodded and said, Then I'll leave it to you. Dean was relieved to see that they didn't have any objections. His actual range of smell was about 30 to 40 miles. The reason why he concealed part of it was mainly because he had offended the bloody swordsman Linda in the consortium. Naturally, he couldn't completely reveal his details. In case he was plotted against in the future, he wouldn't have any leeway to fight back. Do you smell it in the current range? Glenn asked Dudian. Dean sniffed a few times and shook his head. No, but I smell something else. It should be similar to other monsters. We don't need to care about other monsters. We only need to hunt the Black Weaver. Glenn lowered her body and said, Follow me. They groped all the way along the broken highway. Dean and others followed closely behind. Glenn suddenly stopped after 4 or 5 miles. She pointed to a small depression in the distance and said, These are the footprints of a mountain lion. The Black Weaver likes to eat mountain lions. Let's keep up. Glenn looked back at Dean. You write down the smell on these footprints. If you can find a mountain lion, then tell me. Dudian nodded. Everyone followed the direction of the huge footprints that were more than a meter long. After a while, Dean suddenly said, There are other monsters in front of us. There are 3 of them. Glenn looked at a short youth on her left side. You go and check it out. The short youth nodded slightly. His figure suddenly faded and disappeared into thin air. Dean's pupils shrank as he was stunned. But soon Dean found that the smell of the short youth was still there. The next moment, he noticed that the light seemed to be distorted in the place where the short youth disappeared. There seemed to be a transparent figure moving there. He couldn't help but ask the youth next to him, What is he doing? This is his magic marks ability, discoloration. With his thief profession, he is the most powerful scout of our consortium. The youth casually said. Dean was surprised that there was such a magical ability. In contrast, his super sense of smell didn't seem special. However, if he speculated that his magic mark's real ability could directly absorb cold crystals, then it would be a very powerful ability. Dudian followed the smell of the short youth. He quickly returned and reported to Glenn. There are 3 crocodile headwolves. Glenn slightly nodded and said, Kill them. Then she directly went in the direction that Dean had pointed to. Dean was surprised. He had heard the name crocodile headwolf. It was one of the few monsters that had a hunting level of 13. It was extremely terrifying. If a primary hunter like him encountered it alone, he would definitely die. Even if an intermediate hunter encountered it, he could be killed if he was not careful. Everyone followed Glenn along the broken street ruins and quickly approached the position of the 3 alligator wolves. Dean looked from afar and saw that the 3 alligator wolves were huge. All of them were nearly 3 meters in size. Their names had the word wolf in them. Their appearance was similar to that of a wolf, but their heads were like that of a crocodile. Their mouths were long and protruding. Their sharp canine teeth were crisscrossed from their lips. Dean slightly held his breath as he saw the appearance of the 3 monsters. Whoosh! At this time, Glenn, who was walking in front, didn't stop. She suddenly flew out like a gray afterimage. The moment she rushed out, Dean felt that her smell had faded. To be precise, it had disappeared. Only her previous smell gradually faded in the air. Her armor carried a faint smell, but her face and hands didn't have any odor leaking out. Dean was surprised. At this time, Glenn quickly approached the 3 alligator wolves and appeared in their field of vision. The 3 alligator wolves also reacted and quickly changed direction. They roared and rushed towards Glenn. Whoosh! Glenn's figure suddenly jumped up from the rubble. Like a ghost, she flipped and swept past the crocodile head wolf that was the first to pounce on her. Her figure had just landed when she jumped up and dodged the attack of the second crocodile head wolf. Her feet stepped on the head of the crocodile head wolf that was trying to bite her. Her figure gently flipped and jumped behind the crocodile head wolf. 2 faint silver lights flashed in the air. The next moment, her figure flashed horizontally and appeared in front of the 3rd crocodile head wolf, pouncing over. She calmly looked at it pouncing over with its big, bloody mouth. Her figure suddenly flashed and appeared on the other side of it like a ghost. At this time, there was a sudden sound. The lower jaw of the first alligator wolf fell off from its neck. Its body fell down and blood gushed out. The ground was quickly dyed red. Dean was dumbfounded. Chapter 104. At this time, Dean noticed that there was a slender strap on the outside of Glenn's thighs. There were 2 inconspicuous black daggers inserted upside down. They were a few centimeters longer than ordinary daggers. The front of the dagger was slightly curved like a sickle. At the moment, the tip of the dagger was dripping blood. It was the blood of the crocodile head wolf. Assassin. Dean suddenly thought of Glenn's profession. In the past few months of training, he had heard some news about the 2 famous senior hunters of the Melon Consortium. Their professions were warrior and thief, respectively. Glenn was a thief, but she had already advanced twice. From an ordinary thief who explored the path and made traps, she had risen to a deadly assassin who killed without blinking an eye. Just like her profession codename, Ghost Assassin. After each advancement, she would get a title that matched with her ability. It was said that Glenn's magic mark ability came from the ghost eye. It was a very terrible monster. Its vision was very strong, and its body was flexible. Moreover, it knew how to hide its breath. It could quietly approach its prey like a snake lurking in the shadows. It would wait for the right opportunity to strike. Most of the reason why her smell had suddenly disappeared was because of the magic mark. Dean was shocked. The 3 crocodile head wolves were rated as level 13. It was obvious that their combat power was far higher than the defiler that he had encountered before. However, they were instantly beheaded by this woman. His vision couldn't keep up with her speed. Moreover, the whole beheading process was as smooth as flowing water. It fully demonstrated the rich hunting experience of the other party. All the wounds were fatal. Moreover, the point of entry was the weakest part of the body. Glenn slightly waved to the others to keep up. The other 5 people stared at each other as they saw her skills. They were speechless. After all, if they were in her shoes, they would need perfect cooperation to kill the crocodiles. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. It was obvious that the gap between them and the top hunters was huge. The smell of blood will attract other monsters. The Black Weaver is timid and vigilant. It won't come over easily. Let's continue to chase. Glenn whispered as she led the way. The other 5 quickly followed. Dean looked at the 3 corpses on the ground. He couldn't help but say, "They're corpses? Are we going to leave them here?" Little guy, the value of the crocodile head wolf's carcass is not high. The fat in its body is too little, and there is more radiation in its hair. The value of collecting it is not high. We should hurry up, a youth at the end said to Dean. Because of Dean's super large range of smell, he put away his contempt for the newcomer and patiently explained. Dean caught up with the team. Following the mountain lion footprints left on the ground, everyone chased all the way. Occasionally, the footprints disappeared, but with Dean's sense of smell, he could easily find new footprints from hundreds of meters away. This was the advantage of tracking by smell, and it was an ability that many hunters envied. Along the way, they encountered a few more waves of monsters, but Glenn didn't need to do anything. She could easily take care of them all by herself. However, when they encountered a level 19 lizard, Glenn chose to take a detour. She didn't go forward to fight. Although with the cooperation of the 7 of them, there was hope to kill the monster, but it was easy to cause a big movement, attract other monsters, or scare away the Black Weaver. In addition to the lizard, they also met a monster that they couldn't name. According to Glenn, it was a new type of monster that hadn't been named yet. If they killed it and brought its corpse back to the giant wall, they would get extra rewards. However, Glenn didn't intend to get involved. She gave up hunting and continued to pursue the Black Weaver. Let's take a break. The continuous journey had consumed a lot of physical strength. Glenn had continuously fought and consumed a lot of strength. She saw that it was noon, so she stopped and said to everyone, "Eat something to supplement." Everyone listened to her instructions and sat down to rest. They took out dry food and water from their backpacks and ate. Dean came in a hurry, so he didn't bring anything. He could only watch others enjoy lunch. "Here you go." Glenn looked at him and took out dry food from her backpack. She threw it to Dean. "If you can find the Black Weaver, I will owe you a favor." Dean took the dry food. He was somewhat grateful, but was surprised. "Owe me a favor? Aren't we carrying out the task under the Consortium's order?" "Yes, it is the Consortium's order, but the Black Weaver that we hunt belongs to me." Glenn didn't hide it. "So, instead of helping the Consortium, it is better to say that you are helping me. I have the first priority in choosing such a rare monster. Unless I don't want it, the Consortium will allocate it to the other 8 intermediate hunters. However, I like the magic marks of the Black Weaver." Dean suddenly realized that he didn't see this benefit in the contract. Most of the benefits were for intermediate hunters. As for primary hunters like them, even if they hunted a named monster, they would have to hand it in. Otherwise, there would be punishment. However, a named monster wasn't something that primary hunters could hunt. The Black Weaver that they had encountered before was in its infancy stage. It was completely luck that they were able to meet it. "It's within my ability." "You are too polite," Dudian replied politely after understanding the situation. Glenn shook her head. "I just don't like to feel indebted to others. So if it's a favor, then it's a transaction for me. As long as you have a need, I'll help you. Of course, the premise is that we have to hunt down the Black Weaver." Glenn shook her head. "I just don't like to feel indebted to others." Dean thought that she was really direct. He nodded and said, "I know. I will try my best." "Well." Glenn nodded slightly and no longer said anything. She turned to look at the ruins in the distance. It seemed that she was thinking about something. Dean quickly finished the dry food and took a little rest. Although Glenn had promised him a favor, but he didn't take it too seriously. He felt that this woman was a very calculative person. So even if he got this favor, he could only ask her for a small favor. He couldn't ask her for a big favor. Suddenly, Dean's nose twitched. He stood up and said, "I found the mountain lion." The others were silently eating dry food while thinking about their own thoughts. They heard Dean's words and looked up. They quickly put away the dry food and stood up. One of them hurriedly asked, "Where?" Dean pointed to the left. "About 20 miles from here. Let's go." Glenn made a prompt decision. She threw away the half-eaten dry food and quickly ran in the direction pointed by Dean. Chapter 105. All the way along the broken streets covered with moss and gravel, they soon came to a low-lying, desolate open space. The area was extremely open. Dudian could vaguely see the outline of the building from the street, but the upper part had long collapsed. Broken walls and concrete gravel wrapped with steel bars were piled up on the road and covered with vegetation. Glenn's figure suddenly stopped and looked at somewhere in front of her. She raised her hand and said, "Gat, go and check it out." The one called Gat was the young thief who had the ability to change skin color. He nodded slightly, and the color of his body quickly changed. Even the black armor on his body disappeared. Dean was still surprised when he saw it again. He asked in a low voice, "Can his ability affect the armor?" "Of course not. His armor is specially customized from the Consortium. It is said that it is made from the skin and scales of the magic lizard. It can resonate with his ability." A young man next to him whispered. Dudian subconsciously thought that if it was against the enemy, this ability was nothing to be afraid of. Like his own smell ability, he could easily restrain it. Even if he didn't have the sense of smell, as long as he splashed some dust or paint on the opponent's body, the discoloration ability would be completely useless. However, the terrible part of this ability was the sneak attack. It could quietly approach and kill. After all, even a strong person couldn't be vigilant all the time. After a moment, Gat returned and reported, "It is indeed a mountain lion. It has hunted a scythe-hand undead and is eating." Glenn nodded slightly. "There are not many mountain lions. Black Weaver will certainly keep an eye on it. Let's wait here. Don't get too close." After saying that, she took out a bottle of pale yellow powder from her backpack, poured it into her palm, and gently sprinkled it on her tight-fitting armor. In an instant, her faint, fragrant body odor was covered by a thick stench of rotting corpses. The others were already experienced. They took out a bottle of the same pale yellow powder from their backpacks and smeared it all over their body. Their smell was immediately covered. Glenn threw the bottle into Dean's hand. "This is undead powder. It can cover up the smell, but be careful not to smear it on your skin or it will get infected." Dean took it and thought that the effect of this thing was similar to the undead plasma he smeared when he escaped the pursuit of the Defiler. In contrast, the smell of the rotten, undead plasma was stronger and more thoroughly covered. However, once the blood was smeared on it, it was very troublesome to wipe it off, unlike this powder, which could be easily removed by patting it with a cloth. After the 7 people were all smeared with the undead powder, only the smell of the undead was left in the place. Glenn glanced at the 6 people in the team and said, "And Luo, take the 2 of them to another direction and wait there. Be careful not to expose yourself. Signal if anything happens." And Luo's brown-haired young man nodded. Then, he turned around with the other 2 young men and left quietly. They followed the pile of rubble to another place. Dean couldn't help but ask, "Are we going to wait like this?" "That's the only way." Glenn lowered her voice. Dean asked, "What if the Black Weaver doesn't come?" "Then we will continue to wait." Glenn looked at him and said, "Hunting requires patience. Even if it is hungry, at least we still have food. Although there is more than one mountain lion in area number 1, there will be a time when it will run out." Dean thought that patience was good, but it was too stupid and inefficient to wait like this. He said, "I have an idea, but I don't know if it is feasible or not." "Huh?" Glenn and the other 3 looked at him with some doubt and astonishment. They thought that he was just a newbie who had just come to hunt. Could it be that he had any ideas? Dean looked at Glenn. "Area number 1 is too big. It will be a waste of time if we wait. Maybe the Black Weaver is looking for food at the moment. Since the mountain lion is its favorite prey, I think the mountain lion should know how to avoid its natural enemies. Therefore, the mountain lion probably won't go to the areas where the Black Weaver will appear. In other words, the chances of the Black Weaver finding it are very small. So, it is better to take the initiative to find the Black Weaver and bring the mountain lion in front of it." Glenn and the others were surprised. They thought about it carefully and felt that what Dean said was reasonable. All creatures have the instinct to avoid their natural enemies. Mountain lions live in area number 1. Naturally, they have a very strong beast intuition. You are right, but it is easy to say but difficult to do. If we kill the mountain lion, although we can use the smell of its blood to lure it, but the Black Weaver is too cunning. A dead mountain lion will not be able to arouse its interest. Glenn shook her head. Dean said, "Of course not to kill it. Many beasts don't eat dead things. These monsters are no different from beasts. I mean, we should use the method of scaring the mountain lion so that it will panic and run around. The chances of attracting the Black Weaver's attention will naturally increase." Glenn and the other 3 were startled. They looked at each other. "Yes, this is a good idea." The previous thief, Gat, couldn't help but clap his hands. The other man and woman couldn't help but look at Dean in surprise. They thought that this little melonhead was very smart. He could come up with such a clever idea. Glenn deeply looked at Dean and turned to Gat. "Call the 3 of them back." Garter immediately agreed and disappeared. Dean hesitated. Although this method is efficient, but there is a drawback. "I know. Glenn didn't wait for him to say, "You don't have to worry. If we encounter other prey along the way, as long as it is below level 25, I can contain it by myself. I won't let the mountain lion die." Dean saw that she had considered this point, and he was relieved. If he didn't say it out loud, it would be his mistake if such a situation were to occur. Soon, the three who had left to squat came back, and Luo looked at Dean and said to Glenn, "Isn't this too rash? Let's do it." Glenn expressed her choice. She looked at the youth behind him, Luo, and said, "Shoot it." The youth with the bow was the only hunter in the team besides Dean. His ability wasn't tracking by smell, but ultrasonic hearing. He had heard the previous conversation between Dean and Glenn. He slightly nodded and moved forward hundreds of meters. He came to the top of a stone and exposed his upper body. He pulled the bow and pulled an arrow. He quickly aimed at the front, and the arrow flew out. Roar! A painful scream echoed. It was particularly loud in the silent ruins. It was followed by the sound of galloping hooves running into the distance. Glenn, Dean, and the others quickly followed. They saw the place where the mountain lion had stopped. There was a bloody carcass on the ground. The internal organs and other organs were scattered on the ground. Chapter 106. In the process of chasing, Dean finally saw the appearance of the mountain lion. It was similar to the lions he knew. The only difference was the size. It was 3 to 4 meters tall and had a strong physique. The hair on its body was like sharp needles. The forelimb joints had 3 sections. Its running posture was like a spider crawling on the ground. At the moment, there was an arrow at the end of its tail. The severe pain made the mountain lion scream and run away in panic. It didn't have the slightest cruel and bloodthirsty appearance. Dean and others were smeared with undead powder, so they were not afraid of exposing their whereabouts. They followed the mountain lion closely. The distance between them was only a few hundred meters. There was a smell in front. As Dean ran, he quickly sensed the surrounding scents. He had smelled these scents early on, but he didn't warn them until they were within 20 miles. Position: 11 o'clock direction. Glenn raised her hand and made a gesture. Garter, who was in the team, understood and disappeared. After a moment, Garter reappeared in the team and said, "It's a dead blood beast." Glenn said, "Don't pay attention to it. Continue to chase." Everyone followed the mountain lion. When a mountain lion was tired, the young hunter would pull out an arrow and shoot it. His archery was accurate and hit the target every time. On the way, occasionally some monsters of level 7 to 8 appeared. They hid in the dark and attacked Dean and others. The undead powder on their bodies made them look like walking corpses in the eyes of these monsters. Although most monsters have no appetite for ordinary walking corpses, some monsters below level 10 still like to eat this kind of fresh and juicy food with no spikes on the carapace. However, with Dean's sense of smell and the young hunter's strong hearing, these hidden monsters were discovered early on. Before they could attack, they were easily beheaded by Glenn. Her actions were clean and neat. The battle was almost finished in a few seconds. It was a complete crushing. Although the mountain lion was brutal, it was a little frightened when it was suddenly attacked. In its senses, it didn't know that the attack came from several walking dead behind it. It ran around in panic. Sometimes it was shot too painful, so it couldn't help but turn back and roar. However, it couldn't see the enemy, so it could only vent its anger on the walking dead behind it. The mountain lion's counterattack was expected by Glenn, Dean, and the others. They quickly ran to other areas that they hadn't passed through. The plan was still going on. Occasionally, it was more efficient. 2 hours later, everyone had used up most of their energy, so they stopped provoking the mountain lion and told it to rest. They also sat down nearby to rest. Such a big movement. Won't it scare away the Black Weaver? A young man couldn't help but ask. "Will you be scared by your own food?" Glenn asked. The young man was rendered speechless. Dean took the bottle of water from Glenn. He felt uncomfortable as he thought that she had drunk from his mouth. He quietly wiped the mouth of the bottle and then lifted the bottle to drink from it. Glenn sneered as she saw this scene, but didn't say anything. Dean returned the bottle to her and was about to rest. Suddenly, his body's pores slightly shrank. He he suddenly smelled a strange, fishy smell approaching from about 30 miles away. This smell was the smell of the black weaver that he had smelled from the black fragment. It finally appeared. Dean rejoiced in his heart. The sooner he could complete the hunting mission, the sooner he could go back and continue training. Otherwise, every day he stayed in the dangerous area number 1, there was a possibility of changes happening. He didn't make a sound immediately, but waited quietly. Soon, the smell of the black weaver was about 25 miles away. At this time, the smell gradually faded, and the body seemed to disappear. Dean was startled. He was puzzled. "What's wrong?" Glenn looked at him. Dean saw that she was aware of his expression, and his heart shivered. "Nothing." Glenn looked at him, but didn't say anything. She sat down and rested. Her eyes fell on a mountain lion that had stopped walking slowly in the distance. A few minutes later, Dean suddenly smelled the smell of the black weaver that had disappeared before. It appeared again. Moreover, the place where the black weaver appeared was 8 miles away. The smell was extremely faint. It seemed that the black weaver was desperately trying to restrain itself. If the distance was not too close, it would be almost impossible for him to smell it. It's approaching very fast. Dean was shocked. He knew that he couldn't wait any longer. He immediately said to Glenn, "It appeared. It's coming here. It's about 7 miles away. No, it's even closer." Glenn and the other 5 were surprised. Get anxiously said, "Why didn't you say so earlier? Isn't the range of your sense of smell 20 miles? Dean frowned. It used some method to hide its smell. It suddenly appeared 7 or 8 miles away. "Get ready," Glenn quickly said. "The black weaver likes to sneak attack underground." Dean was able to smell it from about 8 miles away. It's very rare. Everyone prepare for battle. Gat, you protect Dean. Gat and the other 4 reacted. They thought that the black weaver's sneak attack had killed 3 of them, even though there were hunters in the team. It was obvious that the black weaver's sneak attack ability was far beyond their imagination. They pulled out their weapons and were on full alert. Glenn stared at the mountain lion in the distance. Kill it at all costs. It's best not to make any mistakes. Yes, Gat and the others' faces slightly changed as they immediately responded. At this time, Dean smelled the smell of the black weaver. It was about 2 miles away. The young hunter in the team seemed to have heard the movement. He hurriedly said, "It's in the 4 o'clock direction. It's going to appear." Glenn stroked the jet-black dagger beside her leg and said in a low voice, "Get ready." At this time, the mountain lion seemed to be aware of something. It stopped and turned its head to look around. It growled in a low voice as if it was trying to intimidate something. With a puff, the ground beneath it suddenly cracked open. A sharp and long black blade pierced through the soft abdomen of the mountain lion and pulled downwards. Crash! The liver and other bloody organs fell out. Large and small intestines, blood vessels, and other parts were washed out along with a large amount of blood. Roar! The mountain lion roared in grief and indignation. It twisted its limbs to struggle, but it was like a trapped beast in a cage. The ground around it cracked one after another. Sharp black thorns shot out from the ground and penetrated the body of the mountain lion. It was as if it was nailed to death by several black thorns. Whoosh! A ghost-like shadow flashed past. It was Glenn. Chapter 107. Squeak! A subtle sharp sound came from the soil under the mountain lion's feet. 4 or 5 black spikes pierced the mountain lion's body, quickly shrank back into the soil, leaving only a few bowl-sized holes. "Want to run?" Glenn raised her eyebrows. She didn't expect that the black weaver, who was a level 26 hunter, wouldn't have a bit of backbone. Even though it was injured, it still wanted to escape. Glenn's reaction was quick. She bent down and grabbed her dagger. She stabbed into one of the holes. The dagger seemed to have pierced something in the soil. A painful scream came from inside, but soon there was no more sound. "Come out!" Glenn's heart was filled with hatred. The 2 daggers in her hands suddenly flew out like a rotating knife dance. The soil under the dagger was quickly pried up and dug a deep hole. At this time, the other 3 quickly arrived. One of them, a young knight, let out a loud shout. He raised his spear and thrust it into one of the holes in the ground. When the spear was halfway in, it seemed to have stabbed something and stopped. The other two people saw this and hurriedly moved closer. The young knight poured all of his strength into the spear. The veins on his arms bulged. He clenched his teeth and breathed out a big breath of hot air. He suddenly lifted the spear and stabbed again in the same place. Clang! A hard force was transmitted from the bottom of the spear. The knight couldn't help but be startled. At this time, the other youth's complexion suddenly changed. He hurriedly turned back and said, "Dodge." He hadn't finished his words when a black spike suddenly ejected from the soil behind the knight. It was like a scorpion's tail swinging toward his back. Puff! Suddenly, the black spike snapped in the air. It was Glen, who had mysteriously appeared behind the young knight. The dagger in her hand was stained with green blood, and her face was full of murderous intent. She quickly inserted the dagger into the leggings and then raised her hand to grab the retracted part of the spike and pulled it with all her might. The knight reacted. His whole body was drenched in cold sweat. He quickly turned around and angrily thrust his spear towards the place where the spike was exposed. There was a scream from the ground. Suddenly, 4 or 5 black spikes shot out of the soil. There was no warning, and the speed was extremely fast. There was almost no time to react. The sword-wielding youth from before seemed to have anticipated this and reacted first, swinging his sword to block. The other young man was not so lucky. His reaction was a bit slower, and one of the black spikes pierced into his thigh. The flexible hunting armor did not have much resistance, and it was pierced through instantly. The tip of the spike pierced into his thigh, and a small part of the sharp horn poked out from the back of his thigh. The young man screamed in pain and brandished his saber in terror. With a clanging sound, the sharp blade was unable to cut through the black spike. The layer of shiny black carapace on its surface was extremely tough, causing the blade to easily slip. The black spike swung and dragged the young man's thighs along with it. The tearing pain made him sweat profusely. He tried his best to endure it, but the pain still made his face contorted. He could only swing his saber again and again, but the effect was not good, only leaving a few white marks. Dean and Gat were horrified as they saw the scene from a distance. They knew that Glen was able to easily cut off the black spikes. However, they knew how tough and terrifying it was. Whoosh! Suddenly, an arrow tore through the air. With a bang, the arrow hit the black spike and immediately skidded, deviating from its path. Dean knew that it was the previous hunter who shot the arrow from behind. However, the shape of the black spike was oval, and the surface was smooth and tough. If it was not an arrow with strong penetrating power, it would be easy to deflect it. Dean secretly thought that if he could make some small spikes on the arrowhead, then it might play a role. At this time, the young knight hurriedly turned around to help the young man with the saber. The long spear angrily struck a joint in the middle of the black spike, and with a puff sound, the sharp spearhead immediately cut it off along the weak point of the joint. However, the power of the spear was also transmitted through the black spike to the young knight's thigh. The severe tearing pain made his whole body tremble, and he screamed in pain. His hands tightly held his thigh, and a trace of reason was squeezed out from his thigh. He struggled to pull out the broken part of the black spike so that the blood wouldn't splash on his wound. Glen's body swayed as she dodged the black spike that shot out from under her feet. At the same time, she struggled to pull out the half of the black spike in her hand. From time to time, there were sharp cries full of pain and anxiety coming from the soil. In the midst of this thrilling tug-of-war, a sorrowful and angry roar came from the side. It was the mountain lion that was dripping with blood. It was on the verge of death. It roared ferociously as it rushed towards Glen and the others. Glen and the others were caught in a bitter battle. They didn't expect to be attacked by the mountain lion. All of them were surprised. The young man wielding the sword quickly waved his sword to meet the attack. The skin of his arm bulged with fine scales. The fat in the surface layer of the skin turned into a hardened cuticle, and the defense increased several times. The mountain lion fiercely collided with the young man's chest. Bang! Although the young man's block was effective, but the difference in strength between the two sides was too big. The young man was hit and flew upside down. He continued to roll a few times. He hurriedly stabilized his body. But before he could get up, his body trembled. A black spike stained with blood emerged from his back and pierced through his chest. No! The young knight glared angrily. He roared and rushed over while waving his spear. Glenn heard the sound and looked back. Her face couldn't help but change. She clenched her teeth and bent her body slightly. Her slender legs seemed to have a subtle change. There seemed to be something protruding from the black armor on her knees. At the same time, the strength of her arm seemed to have increased a lot. The black spike that she was pulling on seemed to be stretched taut. The back half of the spike's joint was faintly torn. Suddenly, the ground suddenly puffed up. A black giant suddenly flew out from the ground. Glenn, who was struggling to pull, continued to step back. It was as if her opponent had suddenly let go of the rope in a tug-of-war. She suddenly lost her strength and involuntarily retreated. The black spike in her hand was impressively one of the legs of the black giant. At this moment, the black giant used Glenn's pulling strength to quickly rush towards her. Several black, spike-like legs flanked her from both sides. It seemed as if they wanted to hug Glenn. Glenn had been holding back her strength because she had considered such a situation. But after seeing the sword-wielding youth killed, her heart was filled with anger. Her body couldn't help but burst out with strength that exceeded the range that she could bear. Moreover, she didn't think that the Black Weaver would be so insidious. It seemed that she had been waiting for this moment. At this moment, she saw the black giant pouncing straight towards her. Her complexion changed. She hastily twisted her body. There was a faint layer of fluorescence on her skin. Her feet suddenly turned, and her body twisted in an incredible posture. She lowered her body to avoid the black giant. Whoosh! At the same time, 4 arrows were shot from a distance. Chapter 108. As the Black Weaver landed on the ground, everyone finally saw its appearance. Its body was like a giant spider. Its height was about 2 meters, and its body length was nearly 5 meters. There were 8 black, spiky spider legs under its abdomen. Each leg had 3 joints and was flexible. At the front of the legs were 2 crab pincers. From the inside of the pincers, it was obvious that its destructive power was extremely terrifying. Every part of its body was covered with a black hard shell. There was no hair. Its abdomen was extremely bloated like a spider's belly. But at the end of the abdomen, there was a hard, scaly tail. It was like a thick whip covered with spikes. Dean saw the Black Weaver from afar. There was a chill in his heart. From its ferocious appearance, he knew that its combat effectiveness was extremely terrifying. He couldn't help but worry about Glenn. Squeak! The Black Weaver screamed. It was full of impatience and anger. At the moment, 4 of its 8 legs were broken. One of them was an old wound that was still in the process of regenerating. At the moment, the remaining 4 legs were supporting its body. It was staring at Glenn like a tiger watching its prey. When Glenn saw that it finally came out of the soil, she knew that it wouldn't be able to run away for a while. She felt relieved, and at the same time, her previously suppressed killing intent couldn't stop boiling. Her arm shook slightly, and the dagger tied to her leg was sucked into her hand like a magnet. She pulled it out so fast that it was hard to see it clearly. Obviously, she was proficient in it. She held the dagger with both hands and stared at the Black Weaver. Step by step, she approached the Black Weaver. Although she was good at sneak attacks and assassinations, but there was no one in the team who could pin down the Black Weaver. She could only play the role of a warrior. On the flat head of the Black Weaver, 2 scarlet eyes were staring at Glenn. Transparent mucus was dripping from the back of its chin. Suddenly, the Black Weaver's 4 legs sprang towards Glenn. Glenn's face was incomparably cold. There wasn't the slightest trace of fear on her face. The moment the Black Weaver pounced on her, she reacted extremely quickly. Her body flashed like a shadow as she quickly jumped towards the Black Weaver's side to chop it. The Black Weaver didn't have enough time to react to Glenn's sneak attack. However, its head suddenly turned to the left, and a white filamentous substance shot out from its mouth. Glen's complexion changed slightly. She quickly rotated her body to divert the force and change the direction of her attack. After avoiding the white, silk-like object, Glen quickly exerted force on her feet and approached the Black Weaver again. The dagger in her hand quickly chopped at the sharp leg of the Black Weaver. Whether it was the location of the attack or the angle of the attack, it seemed to be just right. Dean's eyes lit up. Previously, Glen had avoided Bai's attack. It was not so much an evasion, but an adjustment in position, so that the next attack would be more accurate and ruthless. Puff! The Black Weaver's sharp leg broke and fell to the ground. Squeak! The Black Weaver screamed in pain, like nails scratching glass, extremely harsh. The blood vessels on Dean's forehead throbbed, and he felt a bit dizzy and headache. Glen didn't seem to be affected. After landing, she rushed forward again. She didn't give the Black Weaver a chance to breathe. The Black Weaver's body fell to the ground, but it didn't jump again. Instead, it suddenly crouched down. When Glen attacked again, the Black Weaver's tail suddenly swept out. Glen's face changed as she heard the sound of the wind. She hurriedly dodged sideways. Once again, the distance between the Black Weaver and the Black Weaver was pulled apart. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, and it only took a short 2 to 3 seconds. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. At this time, the hunter-archer continued to shoot arrows at the Black Weaver. One of the arrows was aimed at the Black Weaver's eyeball, but the position was slightly off by half a centimeter. It stabbed the hard part of the eyeball. Half a centimeter deviation caused a huge difference in the outcome. It showed how important the accuracy of the bow and arrow was. Dean and Gat were watching the battle from the side. They felt sorry for him. At this time, the knight and the sword-wielding youth separated and surrounded the Black Weaver from 3 different directions. The Black Weaver was lying on the ground, looking around. It seemed that it was difficult to deal with the Black Weaver. The knight and the sword-wielding youth didn't dare to act rashly. They knew that they didn't have any fighting ability compared to the Black Weaver. The only thing they could do was to help Glen so that she wouldn't get injured or fall into a desperate crisis. Glen was slightly panting. She wasn't in a hurry to act. She was waiting. The Black Weaver seemed to gradually become impatient. Its body was bleeding because of the broken legs. It was gradually losing its physical strength. If it continued to wait, it would only get weaker. It looked at Glen and the knight. It seemed to be looking for the right opportunity to attack. For a time, the open space was silent. After a few minutes, the restless Black Weaver finally couldn't help but pounce on the knight. The knight's face changed. He hurriedly retreated and waved his spear in warning. However, the Black Weaver pounced on the knight. It used its crab pincers to clamp the spear. Gotcha! The sturdy spear was easily broken. When the Black Weaver attacked the knight, Glen also found an opportunity. She immediately attacked from another direction. Feeling her approach, the Black Weaver immediately turned around and bit her. It was as if the previous attack on the knight was just a cover. The knight was relieved as he was out of the attack range. He hurriedly narrowed the range of the attack. He waved the broken spear to distract the Black Weaver's attention so that it couldn't concentrate on Glen. The shape of Glen's calves was somewhat curved, unlike the straight legs of a normal human. Because of this, her speed had reached a terrifying level. Under the attack of the Black Weaver, Glen's body twisted and turned, unexpectedly dodging all of the attacks. She was like a weightless dust. No matter how fierce the storm was, it couldn't knock her down. Puff! Glen suddenly rushed forward. While the Black Weaver was being harassed by the knight and the sword-wielding youth, she fiercely slashed the side of its head. The sharp dagger pierced into the Black Weaver's head and quickly pulled out. The jagged dents on the dagger were quickly torn apart. The capillaries and veins were crushed, causing a great degree of bleeding. The Black Weaver screamed and turned around to bite back. But Glen had already retreated, so she bit empty air. The knight and the sword-wielding youth were happy to see that their harassment was effective. They harassed the Black Weaver even harder. Chapter 109. More and more blood was flowing out of the Black Weaver's neck. The sharp pain and the loss of physical strength made it panic. It wanted to escape. But Glenn and the knight were experienced hunters. They didn't give it a chance to rush out of the encirclement. Once the Black Weaver pounced on them, they quickly retreated. They didn't want to confront it head-on. After repeated clashes, the Black Weaver's physical strength was getting weaker and weaker. Its movements are getting slower and slower. Even a knight could easily avoid its attacks. Glenn saw that the time was almost right. She seized the opportunity and suddenly pounced on the Black Weaver's back. The sharp dagger was like a fawn. It fiercely stabbed the Black Weaver's side abdomen. However, the originally slow and powerless Black Weaver suddenly turned its head. Its reaction was amazing. It turned back and spat out a white, silk-like substance towards Glenn. The silk-like substance was ejected at an extremely fast speed. It instantly hit Glenn and wrapped her hands and feet. At the same time, the white silk seemed to have a strong corrosive effect. Glenn's hunting armor was gradually corroded. The reversal of the situation surprised everyone. Glenn hurriedly rolled back to avoid the follow-up attack of the Black Weaver. However, the Black Weaver seemed to have gone mad. She didn't give up and continued to chase after her. Glenn was horrified. She hurriedly dodged left and right. At this time, the knight and the knight saw that the situation was not good. They rushed forward to contain the Black Weaver. At the same time, the hunter quickly shot arrows in an attempt to disrupt the Black Weaver's attack. In the face of the three people, the Black Weaver was wholeheartedly chasing after Glenn. At the moment, the upper half of Glenn's body was wrapped by the white silk. The surface of the hunting armor had been corroded. It was estimated that the silk would touch the inner armor and then the skin. At that time, it would cause very serious damage. At the moment, Glenn didn't have time to clean up the white silk. She could only dodge and panic. Dean's face changed. Glenn would be in danger if this continued. He no longer hesitated and said to Gad, "Let's go and help." Gad was surprised. He didn't respond. Dean pulled out the bow on his back and trotted to a position more than 200 meters in front of the young hunter. After all, his effective range was not as far as the young hunter. His range was at most 100 meters. Moreover, he could only hit a stationary target within 100 meters. Fortunately, the Black Weaver was so intent on killing Glenn that he didn't even pay attention to the knight and the sword-wielding youth. Dean followed the Black Weaver until he was within 100 meters of it. He quickly pulled out the arrow and aimed at the Black Weaver's head. At this moment, he immediately realized the difference between shooting a moving target and a stationary one. Black Weaver's constantly shaking head made it difficult for him to aim. He couldn't help but feel a bit irritated. He took a deep breath and stared at Black Weaver's head. From a messy trajectory and continuous ups and downs, he gradually found a familiar trajectory. It was the pattern of Black Weaver's movements. Whoosh! Dean loosened the bowstring, and the arrow flew through the air. Bang! The arrow fell on the hard shell of the Black Weaver's mouth. It only left a small dent and then fell to the ground. Dean wasn't discouraged. He quickly loaded the arrow and shot the second arrow. Bang! The arrow still hit the hard shell of the Black Weaver's head. It didn't cause any damage, nor did it attract the Black Weaver's attention. At this time, Glenn was forced into a street corner by the Black Weaver. Behind her was a pile of collapsed stones. Usually it would be like walking on flat ground. But at this moment, it was a great obstacle for her to dodge. She tripped and suddenly fell down. Her face couldn't help but change. The Black Weaver roared and rushed over. Its flat head was going to bite her. Glenn hurriedly held the dagger and stared at the lower part of the Black Weaver's head. It was the joint of the hard shell and also the fatal part. This was her only chance to survive. She had to fight for it. At this moment of life and death, Dean suddenly narrowed his eyes. The moment Glenn fell down, he didn't feel anxious. Instead, he was particularly ethereal. His mind instinctively emerged the next move of the Black Weaver. He loosened his fingers and the arrow flew through the air. Puff, puff. 2 continuous splashes of blood sounded. The Black Weaver screamed pitifully and fell down. His heavy body pressed down on Glenn's body, covering her. Dean quickly looked and saw the arrow inserted in the Black Weaver's blood-red eyes. His heart burst with joy. Then he thought of Glenn's safety. He couldn't help but tighten his heart. He clenched the bow and waited for the two nearby knights to check. If the Black Weaver still had the strength to fight, he was ready to retreat first. The two knights cautiously stepped forward. They immediately saw a large amount of blood flowing from the Black Weaver's head. They looked at each other. Suddenly, the Black Weaver's body slightly arched. The two were shocked. When they looked again, it was Glenn who was dripping with blood. She crawled out from under the Black Weaver's body. Her whole body was stained with blood and a rancid smell. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they saw this. Glenn used a dagger to cut off the white silk on her body. Although her body was stained with blood, there was an unprecedented happy smile on her face. But the smile was bathed in blood and looked particularly strange. Dean looked at the blood on her body. He suddenly thought that, at the moment, she should be absorbing the parasitic magic worm from the Black Weaver's blood. Once the parasitic magic worm occupied the position of her previous magic marks, it would replace the previous magic marks. During the hunter training, Dean learned that each person could only master one kind of magic mark. Once there were two parasitic magic worms in a human or monster's body, they would kill each other. Just like a mountain can't accommodate two tigers. One must die. Of course, there was an extremely small chance that the two parasitic magic worms would be evenly matched and perish together. Once the parasitic magic worm entered the human body, it would quickly die. The corpse would turn into magic marks. If a new parasitic magic worm came, it would eat the corpse of the previous parasitic magic worm. The parasitic magic worm would also die and turn into new magic marks. This made Dean very curious. Why could the parasitic magic worm survive in the monster's body but die in the human body? However, he didn't go deep into it. This question was probably a puzzle that the major consortia and the Holy Church were eager to solve. It's finally dead. The knight poked the Black Weaver's body. He was relieved to see that the Black Weaver was no longer moving. He looked at Glenn. "Are you okay?" Glenn smiled. "I'm better than ever." He suddenly thought of something and said to the young hunter who was walking over from afar, "It's all thanks to your arrow that hit its eye just now, which caused its body to deviate, allowing me to hit it in one shot." The hunter was embarrassed. "I didn't shoot that arrow. It was Dean." If it was before, he would have called Dean little guy. But after seeing the accuracy of the arrow, he didn't dare to underestimate the newcomer. "Dean!" Glenn was surprised. She turned to look at Dean and Gath. She saw the bow in Dean's hand. She remembered that Dean was also a hunter. She couldn't help but exclaim, "You're a scavenger. How long have you been training in the consortium? Your archery skills are comparable to that of a professional hunter." Dean knew that the arrow was completely luck. There was still a big gap between him and the hunter. He said, "I was just lucky. It's great that I was able to help you." Glenn smiled and said, "You've helped me a lot. I really have to thank you this time." Chapter 110. It's magic marks. Have you absorbed it? Gat rushed over and looked at Glenn, who was covered in blood. He couldn't help but ask. Dean and others' eyes were focused on Glenn. In addition to Dean, the knight and others were envious of her. Although they knew that the magic marks wouldn't fall into their hands, but they still couldn't help but be excited. "Yes." Glenn slightly nodded and smiled. "This time, thanks to everyone's help. I will remember this favor. If you need anything after we return to the giant wall, don't hesitate to tell me." The hunter and others were modest and polite as they heard her words. But in their hearts, they were very happy. They knew that a senior hunter would remember their favor. In the future, it would be useful. Dean looked at the dead swordsman. "Should we take his body back or bury it on the spot?" Glenn looked back and sighed. His body has been infected. It's currently in a suspended animation state. Once the devil's power engulfs his soul, he will become an undead. Let's incinerate him. The hunter and others couldn't help but feel sad. This should be the only pain of this trip. I will take his sword back. The knight picked up the sword from the ground. His expression was a bit down. "I have performed 3 missions with him. I didn't expect that this time. We will be separated forever." Gat came forward and patted his shoulder. He sighed, but didn't say anything. Life and death was a very distant thing for ordinary people. It was difficult to experience it a few times in their life. But for them, they had long been accustomed to it. In fact, they were gradually numb to it. The knife-wielding youth and the hunter found some flammable objects. They used a fire sickle and piled them on top of the sword-wielding youth's body. They incinerated the body. The red gunpowder reflected on everyone's face. It was extremely hot. When a fire extinguished, there was only a charred corpse left on the ground. Glenn came forward and cut off the head of the corpse and buried it on the spot. After dealing with the sword-wielding youth's body, Glenn stood up and went to the side to dissect the body of the Black Weaver. The hunter youth and the sword-wielding youth came forward to help. The three of them were quite skilled. They cut along the gaps and mucous membranes on the inside of the hard shell, peeled off the hard shell, collected the pieces one by one, and piled them neatly at the side. Dean stepped forward to watch their dissection. This was a rare learning opportunity. Although he had learned to dissect some ordinary beasts during the scavenger special training, it was extremely difficult to completely dissect the useful parts of such a monster with a complex body structure. Following the dissection, blood flowed everywhere, and the pungent smell of blood assaulted their nostrils. Organs and other organs rolled down, entangling with the intestines. Dean watched quietly. Perhaps it was because the dissecting object was a monster, but he didn't feel nauseous. Soon, the hard shell, head, spiky limbs, pincers, and other parts were dismembered. Dean saw Glenn cut open its head and took out a white, soft thing from a groove in its jaw. Judging from her expression, it should be valuable and useful material. Strange, it turned out to be empty. Was it done before? At this time, the sword-wielding youth who had cut open the belly of the Black Weaver said in a strange tone. Glenn heard the words and looked over. In addition to the internal organs and other organs, the back of the belly was empty and flat. Dean was puzzled. The next moment, he knew from their dialogue that they were talking about the ovaries. It should have laid eggs before coming out to hunt. Glenn made a speculation and shook her head. No, the survival rate of the eggs is low. It's very difficult to hatch them. Even if it hatches, the parasitic monster inside the body is still very weak and can't form magic marks. The sword-wielding youth was a bit regretful. He could only continue to collect other useful parts. Dean saw the youth take out a mass of yellow liquid from the inner wall of the belly. What is this? It's fat. The sword-wielding youth looked at Dean. It seemed that he remembered the previous praise from Glenn. His attitude was much gentler. This is a good fuel for the oil lamp. It's used by nobles. Dean didn't think that some of the oil lamps in the wall would come in this way. Soon, they had completely decomposed the huge Black Weaver. All the valuable parts were neatly piled together. The remaining internal organs and flesh were scattered all over the ground. In order to prevent other monsters from eating it, Glenn burned it with a big fire and buried it. The air was filled with a strong, pungent smell. It was like cooked meat was soaked in blood. It was extremely fishy. Dean covered his nose. Suddenly, he smelled the residue of the Black Weaver on the ground. The smell was getting stronger and stronger. It seemed that the smell was coming from the soil. Dean was surprised. He couldn't help but look over. He saw that the soil was fluffy compared to the soil next to it. He suddenly remembered Glenn's words. Could it be Captain? At this time, the hunter youth suddenly said, "Now that the hunt is over, I want to go to other areas. It's rare to come outside the giant wall. I have to bring something back. My hands are itching." Glenn was putting the parts of the Black Weaver into a large storage bag. She looked at him and said, "Yes, but I've just absorbed the magic marks. My strength has weakened. I need to go back to the giant wall to rest. It's dangerous for you to go alone." "It's okay. I heard that there is a team in area number 6. I'll join them and get some materials." The hunter youth laughed. Glenn thought for a moment and said, "Well, it's up to you." Dean's heart moved. He thought of the cold crystals he had stored in area number 9. He immediately said, "I also want to go." "You?" Glenn looked at him and frowned. "Area number 6 is too dangerous. There are a lot of monsters that are above level 10. It's easy to attract the attention of monsters. You shouldn't go. Dean said, I'll go to other areas to hunt for undeads. The cold crystals in their heads are very valuable. I'm short of money recently. Hunt undeads? Glenn thought for a moment and said, All right, but the value of cold crystals is quite low. If you're in urgent need of money, I can lend you some. As long as it doesn't exceed 100,000 gold coins, I can still give it to you. Dean was secretly speechless. 100,000 gold coins? It was an astronomical number. It was enough to buy a small town in the residential area. No, I'm short of money. I can earn it by myself, Dean said. Seeing this, Glenn could only say, All right, then I'll escort you there. Chapter 111. Glenn quickly put all the parts of the Black Weaver into a large foldable storage bag in her backpack. She carried it on her back, and it looked even bigger than her slender body. Dean saw that everyone was ready to leave. He hesitated, but said, There seems to be something there. He pointed to the ground that was exuding the smell. Although he had some guesses in his heart, but considering his own ability, he decided to bring it up. Oh, Glenn looked over in surprise and said, There's a smell? It's in the soil, Dean said. After the previous accurate tracking, everyone had full trust in Dean's ability to smell. They looked at each other and cautiously approached with weapons in hand. Glenn winked at the knight. The latter understood and stepped forward. He picked up the soil that Dean was pointing at. After digging out a pit of about 30 centimeters, everyone immediately saw an oval, snow-white object in the sand. Glenn and the others' eyes suddenly lit up. They were pleasantly surprised. Black Weaver's egg. They quickly moved forward and dug the sand. They found that there were as many as 8 Black Weaver eggs buried inside. Dean was happy and regretful that his guess was right. Unfortunately, his strength was too weak. Otherwise, he would have been able to sneak back to get the eggs. However, the area number 1 was too dangerous. Even an intermediate hunter didn't dare to go alone. Although he had a super sense of smell that could detect monsters in advance, but there were some lurking monster hunters who knew how to hide their smell. They would often quietly approach their prey. Such monsters were not uncommon in Area Number 1. The so-called people die for wealth, and birds die for food. He thought about it again and again. In the end, he didn't want to take the risk. After all, God didn't care about him every time. Glenn looked at the 8 Black Weaver eggs in her hand. She was pleasantly surprised. I got so many at once. Maybe one of them will survive. Then I will absorb the Black Weaver's magic marks. My ability will be even stronger. The knight and others immediately congratulated him. Dean suddenly noticed that the hunter was smiling and congratulating him, but his expression was a bit stiff. Because of the height difference between them, it was easy for him to see the other's palm. He saw that the other's palm was clenched tightly. His thumb was slightly rubbing. It seemed that he was trying to endure something. Dean couldn't help but be startled. The next moment he woke up and couldn't help but smile. Previously, when the Black Weaver was lying on the ground, I thought it was to deal with us. I didn't expect that it was actually taking the opportunity to hide its eggs. Glenn recalled the previous battle and sighed. She thought of something and looked at Dean. Fortunately, you observed carefully. Otherwise, you would have missed the 8 eggs. Dean smiled but didn't say anything. He felt helpless in his heart. Although it was unintentional, but he seemed to have offended the young hunter. The latter had ultrasonic hearing ability, so he should have heard the sound of Black Weaver burying the eggs. Moreover, he proposed to go to the 6th area to hunt. It was obviously an excuse. Clearly, he wanted to wait for everyone to leave and then sneak back to get the eggs. However, his plan had been inadvertently ruined by himself. Moreover, his thoughts had been exposed in front of Glenn, the young knight, and the others. After all, no one was stupid. They just didn't show it at this moment. He probably hates me. Dean looked up at the young hunter, but saw that there was a smile on his face. It seemed that the young hunter didn't notice him. If it was an ordinary person, most of them would think that he was thinking too much. But Dean still felt that he couldn't let go of his guard. He secretly remembered the appearance of the young hunter. If he met him outside the giant wall in the future, it would be better to stay away from him as far as possible. Otherwise, if he was secretly retaliated, then he would fall into a situation of eternal damnation. It is entirely Dean's credit that we were able to find these 8 eggs by accident. Glenn looked at Dean and thought for a moment. According to the price handed over to the consortium, each rare monster's egg will be worth 1,000 gold coins. Ordinary monster's egg will be worth 500 gold coins. As for the mammal's egg, it's another matter. The survival rate is relatively high, and the value is sky high. I will distribute the eggs according to the price given by the consortium. In view of Dean's credit, 4 of the 8 eggs will belong to Dean. That is 4,000 gold coins. The rest will be 1,000 gold coins for each of you. As for the eggs, I will give them to the consortium to help me cultivate them. Hearing Glenn's distribution, the young knight and others didn't have any objection. Dean was surprised to see that Glenn had allocated so much to him. He thought that would be good if he could drink the soup. He didn't expect to get half of it. His impression of her improved a lot. This time I have to thank Dean's nose. The young knight smiled. Get also smiled and patted Dean's shoulder. Good job. Dean smiled and said a few polite words to them. After Glenn had collected the 8 eggs, everyone retreated along the original path. Along the way, Dean's sense of smell and young hunters' hearing allowed them to encounter several monster ambushes not far from where they were passing. They would suddenly jump out and attack them, almost causing casualties. Fortunately, Glenn reacted quickly and took the initiative to resist. Through the fight, Dean gradually had an understanding of Glenn's strength. She could easily deal with monsters below level 20, but it would be a lot more difficult for her to deal with monsters above level 20. Moreover, the higher the level, the more difficult it would be. If she encountered a monster like the Black Weaver who was level 26, her life would be in danger if she encountered it alone. After all, if Dean didn't help her to detect the Black Weaver's sneak attack, Glenn may not be able to detect it in time. Under the escort of Glenn, everyone gradually withdrew from area number 1. They came to the giant forest next to the abandoned highway. Glenn let the young knight, Gat, and others go back first. She continued to escort Dean to the cleaned area, which was the area number 7. The last time Dean was scavenging, the area number 7 was still in the process of cleaning. Now the cleaning was coming to an end. Even if there were occasional monsters left, a primary hunter's strength was enough to escape, unless they were unlucky enough to encounter the strongest monsters in the area number 7. After sending Dean to area number 7, Glenn said a few words and then turned to leave. Dean had asked her about the route of each area. Moreover, he had seen Scott's map before. He still had some impression of the area number 7 was not far from the area number 9. Moreover, he was fully armed so he could hunt in the area No. Dean saw a lot of undead swaying on the road. He had heard from Glenn and others that these undead were the last monsters to be cleaned. Unless they encountered them, they would kill them. Generally, they wouldn't take the initiative to look for them. In the first cleaning of each area, they would hunt the monsters that were given a name. They were the most terrible monsters in the area. Monsters that could reach the level of being given a name were far more powerful than ordinary monsters. If they were the first to hunt the undead on a large scale, it would alert the monsters. Some of the monsters would escape to other areas, especially to the areas of other consortia. It was tantamount to becoming the property of other consortia. Chapter 112. Compared to other beast-type monsters, hunting rank 4 ordinary walking corpses was the favorite of junior hunters. They would simply follow the body's instincts and use traps, lures, and other skills to easily hunt them. Unlike other monsters, they had long cultivated a beast-like survival instinct. Even the weak bone-biter rat knew how to avoid danger. It was difficult to capture them with ordinary traps. However, if these ordinary undeads evolved into sickle undeads through a lot of food, their physical qualities would rise sharply. Their combat effectiveness would increase by leaps and bounds. They would be able to fight against intermediate hunters. Moreover, they would evolve a simple consciousness and would not be easily hunted by external forces. Dean had previously seen sickle undeads in area number 1. At this moment, he could distinguish at a glance that these were just ordinary undeads, so he dared to boldly trap and hunt them. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Arrows flew out one by one. His effective range was 100 meters. The height of 100 meters was actually the height of a 24 or 5-story building. Most of the residential buildings were about 4 to 5 meters high, which was a normal specification. At the moment, Dadian was standing at a commanding position. It was the top of a crumbling building that was seriously corroded by moss. It was about 20 floors high and about 80 meters from the ground. All the undeads that were attracted by the stones were within his effective range. The arrows accurately hit the running undeads. Their movement trajectory was extremely easy to capture. After the previous high-intensity experience of shooting the Black Weaver, Dean felt a lot more relaxed when he shot these undeads. At least the prediction of their movements would not be too hard. It was easy to hit them. The sharp arrows from above penetrated the undead's head and nailed them to the ground. Occasionally, there were arrows that penetrated the undead's shoulder collarbone or pierced the face. The strong force drove the undead's body away from the ground. The undeads that had no pain continued to climb up after falling and ran in the direction of the sound source. Dean continued to pull out the arrows, shoot, pull out the arrows, and shoot again. The undeads fell one after another. Soon, the arrows in Dean's quiver were used up. He could not help but smile bitterly. Looking at more and more undeads gathered on the street, he immediately went to the other side of the building, grabbed some stones, and threw them into the distance. The stones fell on the adjacent street, and the sound of shattering was louder in the silent ruins. The undead's ears were particularly sensitive, and they immediately gathered there. Dean took the opportunity to go downstairs. He coated his body with the undead powder that Glenn had given him. He went to the corpses on the ground and cut off their heads. He carried 7 or 8 heads and went back to the building. He found a corner and squatted down. He quickly cut open the heads and found the cold crystals inside. He collected them. After all the 8 heads were cut off, Dean ran out and continued to cut off the heads of the remaining undeads. He secretly dissected them in the corner. After repeating this process 3 times, Dean collected all the cold crystals in the brains of the undeads he shot. At the same time, all the arrows he shot were recovered. Dean didn't rush to continue hunting. Instead, he returned to the top of the building. He held one of the cold crystals, bit his finger, and dripped blood on it. When the cold crystal came into contact with the warm blood, it was like ice coming into contact with extremely hot, boiling water. The spot where the blood dripped rapidly sank and melted, turning into a silver-like transparent liquid. Dadian continued to observe. When the blood melted to the center of the cold crystal, it stopped. It seemed that the remaining temperature was insufficient. As time went by, the temperature of the blood had cooled down, but the cold crystal still maintained the appearance of melting. It was motionless and didn't freeze the blood in the pit into ice. Dean was relieved to see this, but he suddenly thought that this was not enough. So he went back downstairs and collected the blood of the undeads. He took out another cold crystal and dripped the blood on it. However, the undead's blood didn't show any signs of melting. Instead, it fell on the cold crystal and was frozen into a dark red teardrop before it fell to the bottom of the cold crystal. Dean was relieved. My blood has been changed by the magic mark. The cold crystal can't erode my blood. It means that I should be able to directly absorb the cold crystal. He held the cold crystal and wanted to absorb it directly, but there was still a trace of hesitation in his heart. Although he was very clear that he was at least 90% sure of his speculation, there was still a trace of fear for the unknown cold crystal. Moreover, he knew that any experiment needed to be tested repeatedly. Only if the experiment was stable for a long period could it be regarded as a success. He was not sure if there would be any sequelae or side effects if he absorbed too much cold crystal. After all, the cold crystal was too strange. After thinking for a moment, he finally gave up the impulse to absorb the cold crystal. After all, he only had one life. It was better to be cautious. Dean put the cold crystal into his backpack. He grabbed the bow and arrows and continued to hunt the undeads. He was ready to wait for his secret experiment to be completed. Then he would slowly study the secret of cold crystal so that he could make perfect use of it. Time passed quickly. Dean hunted all the way in area number 7. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. The number of cold crystals he had hunted was up to 600, which was equivalent to more than 600 gold coins. In these 2 days, he occasionally encountered some big monsters. He hadn't seen the monster illustrated book, so he couldn't identify the level of the monsters. He could only avoid them. I'll hand over half of these cold crystals and keep the other half. Maybe I'll build a secret base outside the giant wall. Dean thought in his heart while hunting. Suddenly, a familiar smell floated into his nose. Dean was startled. A graceful figure suddenly appeared in his mind. It's her. He would never mistake this smell. It was the bloody swordsman Linda who had almost injured him, about 30 miles ahead. Is she also hunting in area number 7? Dean's eyes flashed. He suddenly remembered that area number 7 was the focus of Consortium's cleaning. It didn't seem strange for Linda to be here. His face couldn't help but change as thoughts flashed in his mind. The so-called enemies on a narrow road flashed in Dean's mind when they first met at the scavenger headquarters. His heart was filled with killing intent. But at the same time, there was a voice in his mind. It was just a verbal conflict. There is no need to escalate to the point of killing. After such a long time, perhaps she has already forgotten about me. Even if she remembered, it would only create a little trouble for me. However, another idea emerged in his mind. This is outside the giant wall. Even if I kill her, no one will know. Moreover, she is not protected by the law inside the giant wall. Even if people know, there is no way to convict me. Even if I kill her, no one will know. Instead, I won't encounter any trouble in the future. Although she is an intermediate hunter, but it's better to strike first and gain the upper hand. Killing is still too ruthless. If I kill her, no one will see. Dean suddenly thought of the hunter who had forced him into a desperate situation. Now he already knew the identity of the hunter. His name was Byrne, the younger brother of that woman. For a time, his heart was hesitating, but suddenly became firm. She will never give up. This time I am in the training camp, so there is no way to deal with me. Once I leave the training camp, she will definitely find ways to plot against me. Cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. The people who have offended must be dealt with cleanly, thoroughly. Dean looked at the scar on his right hand. His soft heart suddenly hardened. He clenched the bow and looked at the big bag of cold crystals in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, but finally gritted his teeth. He took out a cold crystal and cut his palm. Blood seeped out and stained the cold crystal in his palm. Suddenly, the cold feeling poured into his body through his palm. It seemed to enter all the meridians in his body. With my current strength, even if it is an ambush, it will be very difficult to kill her. I only hope that the speculation of the cold crystal is correct, but I can't absorb too much. Dean pursed his lips. He felt the cold crystal in his palm disappear little by little. His heart was getting more and more nervous. After a while, until there was no abnormality in his body, he was a little relieved. He took out another cold crystal and carefully held it. He continued to absorb. Once his body felt uncomfortable, he would immediately stop. This is my only chance to fight back. It is a God-given opportunity. Dean secretly said in his heart, when the training is over, I will go outside the giant wall. At that time, I will let her need me. Only by seizing this opportunity can I avoid future troubles. Cold crystal, don't make any trouble. He could not help but secretly pray. This was a risky move, but if he did not take risks in the future when he came out of the training camp, the situation would be more difficult. He would rather firmly grasp the opportunity in his own hands than let the opportunity fall into the hands of others and then passively fight back. She had been paying attention to Dean's situation and couldn't wait to see him. Pay attention not to leave any clues. Don't let the Consortium's investigation team trace any clues. Although the consortium won't do anything to us even if they know about it, but the consortium is very disgusted with internal strife. They will gradually marginalize us and even assign dangerous tasks to us. Gale's character was calm as he said to Linda. Naturally, Linda indifferently said. They ate and chatted. Soon the meal was over. Linda stood up and patted the dust on her body. Let's go to the Red Lake. There may be traces of the Deinonychus beast. Okay. Several people nodded. After cleaning up, everyone followed behind Linda. They followed the map to a place where there was a lake. Dean felt the cold crystals gradually disappear from his palm. In just a moment, he had absorbed 30 cold crystals. His body still didn't feel any discomfort. Instead, his vision and hearing had improved a lot, especially his sense of smell. Before he could only vaguely sense the approximate position of Linda, but now he could narrow the range to 1 kilometer in diameter. Dean quietly followed the smell as he absorbed the cold crystals. At the same time, he smeared a new layer of undead powder all over his body to ensure that the smell wouldn't be detected by the other party. After absorbing hundreds of cold crystals, Dean gradually felt a burst of heat in his body. His body temperature seemed to have risen a lot. He immediately stopped and didn't dare to continue to absorb cold crystals. At the same time, he was secretly shocked. There was a kind of addictive feeling in the process of absorbing cold crystals. When he came back to his senses, there was a bit of fear. It must be known that each of these cold crystals was the size of a ping pong ball. Even if hundreds of them melted into water, it would be enough to fill several bottles. At the moment, even if it was a one-off saline drip, it would still make people uncomfortable. Dean's body temperature gradually returned to normal as he stopped absorbing the cold crystals. He was relieved and didn't dare to continue to absorb too much at once. He wrapped the rest of the cold crystals and found a place to hide along the way. Then he carried the bow and quiver on his back and followed Linda's scent. The distance between the two was getting closer and closer. Linda and others moved slowly as if they were still hunting along the way. Dean was smeared with undead powder and sneaked at full speed. Moreover, he was approaching in a straight line. Ambush and shoot. My shooting range is too close. Even if I kill Linda, the others next to her will find me and kill me. Dean was like a hound as he chased. Relying on bow and arrows alone is not enough. I can only rely on the third party's power, equipment, and environment. Traps are also a kind of equipment. Although it is a thief's equipment, there is no rule that hunters can't use traps. But the production is too rough. If there is a thief among them, they will certainly not be fooled. His eyes were deep as many thoughts flashed in his mind. Time passed. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. At the moment, it was the rainy season. The sky outside the giant wall was cloudy. The light was dim during the day. The ruins of the city were like a desolate doomsday. Heavy rain had just washed the air. The rotten smell in the air seemed to be a lot fresher. In the Red Lake area, at the edge of the vast lake, the weeds were so dense that they completely covered the road by the lake. The sightseeing boats tied to the lake had long since rotted. The shadows of the boats were like skeletons, leaving only the rotten iron frames. Some boats had even been capsized, leaving only a rotten rope tied to the shore. With the gentle swaying of the lake, the rope could be torn apart with just a little force. Linda and others were squatting in the grass. They were secretly watching the surroundings. They had been here for 2 days. According to the previous hunting experience, it was neither long nor short. There is no smell of Deinonychus. The footprints were left many days ago. It should have gone far. The dark-skinned girl said impatiently. Linda said in a deep voice, "Since it has been here, it will definitely come back." They could only continue to hold their breath and wait. Suddenly, Gale's nose slightly sniffed. His face slightly changed. He whispered, "We are being followed." Followed? Linda was startled. There was a trace of killing intent in her eyes. Is it another team? Chapter 114. A person. All of them were surprised. Gale nodded slightly and said, "He should have smeared undead powder on his body to cover up his smell." In the past 2 days, I have always smelled an undead chasing us. I thought it was just an aimless, wandering undead, but it was obvious that he was chasing us in a straight line. Moreover, he stopped twice when it rained. If it was a real undead, then it wouldn't care about the rain. It shows that he was worried that the powder on his body would be washed away. So he was forced to stop. Linda thoughtfully said, "Listening to you, this person's tracking method is very immature. He thinks that he can use undead powder to cover up his tracks. If he is chasing us in a straight line, then it means that he is coming for us. His tracking method is mostly based on our smell. Since he has the ability to track us, he should know how to rely on undead smell to cover up his scent. He can only track prey, but it is easy to be exposed when tracking others, unless he doesn't know that we have Gale on our team." The dark-skinned girl was puzzled. He doesn't know our team's information, but he dares to track us. Is he a stowaway from another consortium? Linda's face was cold. Maybe he is a junior rookie who strayed into our area. He doesn't know how to tuck his tail between his legs. Even if we kill him, we won't be able to find a reason. Instead of killing him, it is better to capture him alive and hand him over to the consortium. Gale said. Linda got up. Let's go and see. If he is pleasing to the eye, then let him stay. If he is not pleasing to the eye, then kill him. That dino-clawed beast. Nick, Reed, both of you stay here. If there is a situation, use magic smoke bomb to inform us. Hearing Linda's command, the remaining two nodded. Linda took Gale and the dark-skinned girl and quickly chased in the direction that Gale pointed out. On a desolate street, after the heavy rain, the broken streets were covered with mud. The roads were full of potholes. The moss and vines on the ground were soaked in the rain. They were green and attractive. Dean was lying on top of a tall building. He looked at the sky. The muddy light and thick clouds indicated that heavy rain was coming soon. The rainy season is really frequent, Dean said to himself. He took out a few arrows from the quiver on his back and wiped them one by one. The arrowheads were rubbed until they shone like snow. After wiping the rain off the arrows, Dean took out dry food and chewed it slowly to restore some heat to his body. At the beginning of the rainy season, the temperature was still very cold and not suitable for hunting. Large monsters would rest in their nests and sleep. Only some bloodthirsty prey would wander around looking for prey. After he finished eating, he picked up a bowl of rancid blood next to him. This was a bowl that he found in a residential room. Time and radiation had destroyed what humans had built, but most of the mud that originated from nature had been preserved. At this moment, the blood in the bowl was bubbling from time to time, and tiny blood-red maggots were rolling out of the bubbles. They were as bloodthirsty as leeches. Dean inserted the arrow into the bowl and dipped in the blood. He smeared the blood on the upper half of the arrow with a cloth. It was like painting a layer of blood-red paint. Soon, all 6 arrows were painted with a layer of blood and loaded into the quiver. It's coming. Dean looked at the gathering dark clouds in the sky. The faint sound of thunder seemed to resonate with his heart. He squinted his eyes and looked at the street in the distance. There were 3 figures approaching quickly. There was no smell coming out of their bodies. They were like 3 silent stones. Dean was lying on the ground. He was staring at the graceful figure. The sharp arrow was firmly locked on her head. He was waiting for her to enter the shooting range. 300 meters away from him, Gale lowered his body and whispered, "He's on the top of the tall building at 9 o'clock. He should be alert when he smelled our scent. He's motionless now. I think he's waiting for us to take the bait. Quickly kill him," Linda said coldly. "Be careful of traps." Gale said, "His ability is likely to be a thief or a hunter. We have entered his shooting range. If he is a hunter, then the best time to shoot us is the moment we rush into the tall building. So be careful. If he is a thief, then the trap is likely to be buried in front of the tall building." The dark-skinned girl peeked from the corner of the wall and said, "The ground is flat and there are no traps. If there are traps, then it will be in the tall building." What she learned was the thief's techniques, including pathfinding and trap-making. She had absolute confidence in her abilities when it came to traps, unless the other party was an intermediate thief whose knowledge of traps far surpassed her understanding of the concept of traps. However, that was impossible as her immature tracking skills had already revealed everything. Climb from the wall. I'll cover in front. Both of you climb from the left and right side. Linda quickly made a decision. She knew that the longer they dragged, the more time the other party would have to prepare. She wanted to catch them off guard so that they wouldn't expect them to come so fast. Yes, both of them immediately followed the order and split up. Linda pulled out the long sword from her back. She took a deep look at the tall building. The soles of her feet suddenly exerted force as she rushed forward at full speed. She held the sword in front of her chest and stared at the top of the tall building. She was confident that if there was an arrow, she would be able to parry it with her swordsmanship. Break through. This was her fighting style. Although she was a woman, her temperament was more straightforward than a man's. She knew that she was exposed to the enemy's line of sight when she stepped out of the hiding place. She quickly calculated the distance in her mind. 250 meters, 200 meters, 180 meters. When she was close to 120 meters, she still didn't see any movement on the top of the tall building. She couldn't help but wonder if the other party was sleeping. Didn't he realize that they were counterattacking? In addition to this doubt, there was an inexplicable uneasiness in her heart. But at this moment, the arrow was already on the string. She quickly came to 100 meters away. If she continued to move forward, she would be at the bottom of the tall building. The distance between the tall building and the ground was about 60 meters. The other party still didn't shoot an arrow. She had a faint feeling that something was wrong, but her body was already at the bottom of the building. She hesitated for a moment before jumping up along the wall. Her fingers tightly clasped the severely corroded wall. She quickly climbed up. If she stopped, the wall would fall off. Since it couldn't bear her weight, she could only rely on her speed to climb up quickly. Just as he climbed to the third floor, he suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. She was aghast and quickly looked back. Whoosh! Chapter 115. The enemy was coming from behind. At the moment of pain, Linda's mind was instinctively thinking of many ways to deal with the enemy. She held back the meaningless screams and quickly raised the one-handed sword in her hand to block in front of her body. At the same time, she let go of her other hand and fell down. The height of a 3-story building, coupled with her physique and her ability to deflect the force, would not injure her. After landing, Linda looked at the direction where the arrow came from. There was a tall building across the street, but the height was not as high as the one she had climbed. Because of this, she instinctively thought that the enemy would ambush in the tallest building instead of the one next to it. Although it was just a hasty glance, but she still noticed that the arrow came from the top of the building. The enemy was on the top of the building. When she looked up, she happened to see a small figure standing up from a low depression in the wall of the building. He was holding a bow and arrow, quickly knocking the arrow and shooting at her again. Oh, it's him! Linda was stunned when she saw the face of the figure. The horror in her heart made her forget the pain on her face. She never thought that the person she was going to kill would appear outside the giant wall. Moreover, he appeared in front of her, followed her, ambushed her, and even almost killed her. Whoosh! The sound of the arrow breaking through the air awakened her. She hurriedly waved her sword to block. At this moment, her intermediate hunter's physique and superb swordsmanship were reflected. Although her reaction was a little late, but she still cut off the arrow when it flew close to her. The arrow broke and fell to the ground. At this time, Dean continued to put the third arrow on the bow. The moment he put on the bow, he shot it as if he was too lazy to aim properly. However, Linda didn't notice it. Her face slightly changed as she saw the third arrow coming at her. She knew that it wouldn't be a problem to stand here and let Dean shoot at her. She quickly turned around and hid in the building behind her. Who would have thought that as soon as she stepped into the building, her feet would suddenly step on empty air? The moment she stepped into the air, she suddenly reacted as if she had been helped by God and quickly lifted her leg. However, the moment she lifted her foot and was ready to withdraw, a rope was ejected from the collapsed place and wrapped around her foot. The rope was a slip knot, and with a little force it would be tightened. At the same time, the other end of the rope suddenly stretched taut under the force of the ejection. Linda's foot was originally weightless, so when she was suddenly pulled up by a strong force, she suddenly couldn't exert any force. Her leg was pulled straight like a split, and even her body was turned around. In less than 0.1 seconds of panic, she quickly swung her sword and cut the rope around her feet. However, at the same time the rope was cut, the floor above the rope also collapsed, pressing down on her. She hurriedly rolled to the side to avoid the stone. She heard the stone hit the place where she had been standing. There was a loud bang, and dust rose. She couldn't help but pale. She was scared and angry. She was a dignified intermediate hunter, but she was almost killed by a newcomer. If she hadn't reacted in time and cut off the rope, the stone would have seriously injured her. After all, there was still an arrow piercing through her face. If the stone hit the arrow, the wound would be even worse. Dean couldn't help but frown when he saw that the trap didn't hit. There was a trace of fear and helplessness in his heart. An intermediate hunter was far superior to an ordinary person in terms of physique and combat experience. She stood in front of the building and stared at Dean, who was on the opposite building. She didn't dare to continue to hide in the building behind her. Who knew if there were other traps inside? At the moment, she was seriously injured. Moreover, the previous few unexpected attacks had cast a shadow in her heart. She would rather stand here and use her sword to block. She believed that Gale and the dark-skinned girl should have been aware of the situation here. The other party was only one person. As long as she stabilized herself, Gale and the dark-skinned girl could easily capture Dean. However, she saw Dean put away his bow, turn around, and ran. Run? You want to run after injuring me? The trap is useless. The trick is finished. And now you want to run? She was so angry that her body trembled slightly. The muscles on her face affected the arrow wound. The severe pain made her mind go crazy, but she resisted the urge to chase after him. First, there was a trace of worry in her heart. She was worried that there was a trap inside the building. Second, her injury was too heavy at the moment. If she didn't pull out the arrow, she would have to hold it with one hand. Otherwise, the arrow would keep shaking while running. The pain would be worse than death. Moreover, she felt that the arrow was stained with poisonous blood. From the familiar rancid smell, she could judge that it was smeared with undead's blood. She clenched her teeth and pulled the arrow out bit by bit. When the bar behind the arrow was pulled out, it hooked the tender flesh in her mouth. It was so painful that she almost cried. Although this was not the most fatal injury she had ever suffered in her hunting career, it was definitely the most painful one. Finally, she pulled out the arrow. She quickly took out the first aid from her waist bag and bandaged herself to avoid any hidden dangers and other infections. At this time, Gale and the dark-skinned girl rushed over. They were surprised to see the serious injury on Linda's face. "Quickly, Chase. We can't let him run." Linda said vaguely from the other side of her mouth. Gale and the dark-skinned girl looked at each other and quickly chased after Dean. He smeared the blood of the bone-biter rat. Damn! Gale sniffed. He smelled Dean climbing down the wall from the other side of the building. He didn't enter the building anymore. He called the dark-skinned girl and circled around the building to chase. Previously, the smell of the bone-biter rat lingered on the building. He smelled it but didn't care. Bone-biter rats were very common monsters. They could be seen everywhere, but he didn't think that this was the real hiding place of the other party. What he was chasing was just a fake target that had been swapped out. It was even possible that the other party's purpose from the beginning was to deliberately make him feel that he was being tracked. Thinking of this, Gale's heart turned cold. When the two went around the corner, Gale's face suddenly changed and hurriedly said, "Quickly, Chase. He is running away." The dark-skinned girl was surprised. She didn't understand the meaning, but she still sped up. At the same time, she vigilantly scanned the surroundings in case of an ambush. Damn! After chasing half of the street, Gale couldn't help but curse. He quickly said to the dark-skinned girl, he imprisoned 3 bone-biter rats in advance. When he ran to the meeting point, his smell was mixed with theirs. Now these bone-biter rats are running away in different directions. we have to split up and chase him. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.